White powder did not fall from shadows in Gilded Age New York. It rose under chandeliers, counted as progress, priced as refinement, and trusted because it wore the language of science. Gaslight glows over apothecary shelves. Glass vials line up like obedient ideas. Cocaine is introduced not as danger, but as clarity itself, a stimulant for the modern mind, a cure for fatigue, melancholy, weakness, hesitation. Doctors endorse it, newspapers praise it. Society accepts it with a steady hand and an eager pulse. In a city obsessed with momentum, cocaine becomes the chemical promise that no one needs to slow down. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe and stay with this channel. These stories unfold slowly, deliberately, and they reward those who linger. And as you listen, tell me where you're watching from. A city, a room, a late hour, because this story belongs to places shaped by ambition. What begins as confidence soon tightens into compulsion. Sleep grows. Thin. Nerves sharpen. Control becomes performance. Respectability hides dependency, and progress quietly devours itself. This is the rise and fall of cocaine in Gilded Age New York. Not a scandal whispered in alleys, but a catastrophe administered politely, measured carefully, and believed in until it was far too late. New York did not ask whether it should move faster. It simply did. Streets filled, schedules tightened, hours stretched thin until daylight itself seemed inefficient. The city learned to value motion over pause, output over recovery, alertness over comfort. To hesitate was to fall behind. To rest was to risk disappearance. In this environment, anything that promised endurance without complaint was not merely welcomed, it was admired. Cocaine entered this world quietly, without spectacle or scandal. It did not arrive through alleyways or whispered exchanges. It came through respectable doors, carried in clean glass, described in measured language. It was introduced as a modern substance for a modern age, precise, controllable, and refined. Where older remedies dulled the senses and encouraged retreat, this one sharpened. It did not lull the body into sleep. It asked it to remain upright, attentive, capable. The timing was perfect. New York was becoming a city of nerves, telegraphs clicking, typewriters striking, elevated trains rattling overhead. Minds were expected to process more, faster, without falter. Fatigue had no social value. Exhaustion was treated as a failure of character rather than a condition of living. Cocaine promised relief without surrender. It offered energy that did not look like desperation. It felt disciplined. Physicians spoke of it with confidence. Pharmacists handled it without hesitation. The language surrounding it was calm, orderly, reassuring. It was not framed as indulgence, but as assistance, a way to steady the mind, fortify the body, preserve clarity under pressure. A small measure, carefully taken, could banish lethargy and restore focus. It was chemistry in service of progress. What made cocaine distinct was not only its effect, but its posture. It did not demand ritual or secrecy. It fit neatly into the routines of the day. A measured dose before work, another before an evening obligation. It did not interrupt life. It enhanced it. Or so it seemed. The drug aligned perfectly with the era's moral expectations. One could remain composed, productive, and presentable while using it. No slurred speech, no visible stupor, just a steadier hand and a brighter gaze. In this way, cocaine did not challenge respectability. It reinforced it. It allowed people to meet expectations that were already becoming unreasonable. Long hours became manageable. Social obligations no longer felt draining. The body's natural resistance was interpreted not as warning, but as inefficiency to be corrected. Cocaine offered correction. New York embraced it because it reflected the city's own self-image. Fast, sharp, forward-looking. Unburdened by sentiment, proud of its ability to outrun limits, the substance was praised not for pleasure, but for performance. It was the stimulant of ambition, not escape. That distinction mattered. It allowed cocaine to pass without scrutiny. Yet from the beginning, something subtle shifted. The line between assistance and necessity blurred quietly. What had been taken to meet a demanding day began to feel required to face an ordinary one. The body adapted without announcement. Energy borrowed demanded repayment. but repayment could be deferred, at least for a time. No alarm sounded, no sudden collapse followed. The city continued to function, and so did its people. That was the danger. Cocaine did not announce its cost immediately. It allowed confidence to persist long enough for dependence to settle unnoticed. What began as a solution to speed slowly became a condition of survival within it. In a city that refused to slow down, cocaine did not create the problem. It merely offered an answer that felt perfect, until it wasn't. New York did not become restless overnight. The change crept in gradually, disguised as improvement. Each new invention shaved minutes from tasks that once took hours. Each innovation promised efficiency, precision, mastery over time itself. What had once been considered a full day's work began to look inefficient, even indulgent. The city did not simply grow, it accelerated. Movement became the measure of worth. Streets pulsed with carts, carriages, and elevated trains whose iron frames thundered overhead, reminding everyone below that delay was unacceptable. Offices multiplied, each one demanding punctuality, attention, and speed. Bells rang, whistles blew, schedules tightened. Time ceased to feel generous. It became something to conquer. In earlier decades, the human body had been allowed certain courtesies. Fatigue was expected. Slowness was tolerated. But as New York expanded upward and outward, patience eroded. The city's pace was no longer set by daylight or season, but by demand. Work did not pause because the body tired. Instead, the body was expected to adapt. This shift reshaped not only labor, but character. Alertness became a virtue. Sharpness of mind was praised above steadiness of spirit. Those who moved quickly were admired. Those who hesitated were quietly replaced. Rest acquired an uncomfortable association with weakness. To admit exhaustion was to confess inadequacy. The language of progress reinforced this transformation. Newspapers celebrated speed. Industry leaders praised endurance. The modern individual was described as energetic, tireless, resilient. Slowness belonged to the past. Efficiency belonged to the future. And New York intended to live in that future immediately. Within this environment, the nervous system came under constant strain. Clerks processed endless figures. Operators listened for signals that never stopped. Writers, editors, brokers, and physicians all learned to maintain attention for hours without relief. The city demanded not just physical labor, but sustained mental vigilance. The mind, like the machines it served, was expected to run continuously. Cocaine found fertile ground here not because it was exotic, but because it aligned so neatly with this new expectation. It answered a problem the city had created but refused to acknowledge. Fatigue was no longer a natural signal. It was an obstacle. Cocaine offered a way around it. What distinguished this era was the normalization of strain. People learned to live in a state of mild urgency, their nerves perpetually engaged. Silence became uncomfortable. Stillness felt unproductive. Even leisure adopted the rhythm of work, structured, efficient, purposeful. The city did not merely move fast, it trained its inhabitants to feel uneasy when they did not. Under gaslight and schedule, the body's quieter needs were ignored. Sleep shortened, meals were rushed, recovery was postponed. Cocaine did not initiate this imbalance, it simply promised to smooth its consequences. A small measure could restore alertness. A careful dose could sharpen focus. It allowed the city's demands to be met without outward complaint. Crucially, this acceleration was celebrated as progress, not questioned as cost. New York's identity became bound to its speed. To slow down felt unpatriotic, even immoral. The individual who faltered was not pitied, but corrected. The city did not ask whether its pace was sustainable. It asked only who could keep up. Thus, cocaine was welcomed not as indulgence, but as adaptation. It allowed bodies to behave as if they were built for a tempo they were never meant to sustain. The early praise was sincere. The benefits were real. Energy returned, focus sharpened. The day became survivable again. But beneath this triumph lay a quiet distortion. When the city learned to hurry, it forgot how to listen. The body's warnings were overridden. Fatigue was chemically silenced rather than addressed. The drug fit so seamlessly into daily life that its presence felt almost natural. New York had taught itself to run. Cocaine ensured it would not feel the strain, at least not yet. Fatigue was no longer granted the dignity of being ordinary. In Gilded Age New York, tiredness became suspect. It suggested a flaw not in circumstance, but in constitution. A person who flagged was assumed to lack discipline, vigor, or resolve. The city did not pause to ask what had been demanded of them. It asked only why they could not endure. This shift was subtle, but decisive. Where exhaustion had once been understood as the body's natural reply to effort, it was now reframed as inefficiency. The language surrounding work hardened. Employers spoke of stamina, physicians spoke of nerves, newspapers spoke of modern strength. The implication was clear. A capable person should be able to withstand the pace without complaint. In this atmosphere, rest acquired a faint moral stain. Sleep beyond what was strictly necessary was indulgent. Leisure required justification. To admit weariness was to confess inadequacy. Many learned to hide it, masking their strain behind composure and routine. The city rewarded those who appeared untroubled by demand. Medical authority reinforced this outlook. Doctors increasingly described fatigue not as a signal, but as a condition to be corrected. Nervousness, lethargy, and mental dullness were framed as disruptions to productivity rather than warnings from the body. Treatments were offered not to restore balance, but to return the patient to function as quickly as possible. Cocaine entered this framework effortlessly. It did not ask why someone was exhausted. It addressed only the symptom. Its effects were immediate and reassuring. Weariness receded. The mind brightened. The hands steadied. The individual could return to their obligations without the embarrassment of slowing down. In a society that prized appearance as much as performance, this mattered deeply. What made this transformation particularly insidious was its politeness. No one demanded outright that people abandon rest. Instead, the expectation emerged quietly. Competent individuals simply did not tire. Or, if they did, they managed it privately. Fatigue became a personal shortcoming rather than a shared condition. This belief reshaped self-perception. People began to judge themselves harshly for natural limits. A long day no longer justified exhaustion. A sleepless night became a failure of management. Cocaine offered relief not only from tiredness, but from shame. It allowed the user to meet expectations without revealing strain. The drug's respectability shielded it from suspicion. Because it did not produce obvious intoxication, it seemed compatible with self-control. One could remain precise, alert, and outwardly calm. Cocaine did not undermine discipline. It appeared to support it. This illusion was crucial to its acceptance. As fatigue lost legitimacy, reliance grew quietly. The line between occasional assistance and routine necessity blurred without announcement. A dose taken to recover from an unusually long day became a precaution against an ordinary one. The body adjusted. The mind recalibrated. What had once been extraordinary became expected. New York's culture of relentless motion left little room for reflection. There was no pause to consider whether constant alertness was sustainable. The city rewarded endurance, not wisdom. Cocaine thrived in this environment because it promised to make endurance effortless. Yet beneath the surface, a contradiction took hold. The more fatigue was denied, the more deeply it embedded itself. Cocaine did not eliminate exhaustion. It postponed its reckoning. Each reprieve came at the cost of deeper depletion. But the city was not listening. It had already decided that tiredness was a flaw to be corrected, not a message to be heard. In treating fatigue as failure, New York prepared itself for dependence without ever admitting it. Alertness was sold as a virtue before it was understood as a state. It was described in pamphlets and conversations as clarity, readiness, command. To be alert was not merely to be awake, but to be present in a way that impressed others. The eyes were bright, the posture steady, the mind responsive. In Gilded Age New York, this condition was treated as evidence of good character. Cocaine's appeal rested almost entirely on this promise. It did not advertise escape or pleasure. It promised something far more acceptable: vigilance, the ability to meet the day without hesitation, to sharpen attention where it had dulled, to remove the fog that gathered behind the eyes after too many hours of work. The promise was not excess, but precision. Medical descriptions reinforced this framing. Cocaine was spoken of as a stimulant that clarified rather than overwhelmed. It heightened perception without inducing confusion. It energized without visible disorder. This distinction mattered. Substances that dulled or distracted were viewed with suspicion. Cocaine, by contrast, appeared to restore function. It returned the individual to themselves, or so it seemed. The language surrounding alertness was meticulous. It emphasized balance and control. A careful dose could heighten mental acuity. A measured amount could steady trembling nerves. The user was not surrendering judgment, but reclaiming it. This reassurance allowed cocaine to enter spaces where other drugs would have been barred: offices, clinics, homes, social gatherings. New York's professionals embraced this promise readily. Lawyers valued sustained concentration. Physicians required steady hands and sharp minds. Clerks depended on accuracy under pressure. Artists sought focus without fatigue. Cocaine appeared to serve them all. It allowed long hours without visible decline. It permitted intensity without collapse. Crucially, alertness was not framed as an altered state. It was presented as a correction. The aider drug did not make the user more than they were meant to be. It simply restored what modern life had taken away. This framing absolved both user and substance of responsibility. If cocaine was merely returning the body to its proper function, then its use was not indulgent. It was sensible. The promise extended beyond work. Social life in New York was demanding in its own way. Evenings required presence, wit, responsiveness. Fatigue threatened embarrassment. Cocaine offered a way to remain composed and attentive long after the body would normally withdraw. One could attend, converse, perform, and return home without visible strain. What went unspoken was the cost of sustaining this state. Alertness, when chemically maintained, demanded repayment. But the bill did not arrive immediately. The effects were subtle. Sleep shortened, appetite shifted. The mind grew accustomed to stimulation. None of this seemed alarming at first. The benefits were too immediate. The city rewarded the appearance of readiness far more than it punished unseen consequences. The promise of alertness reshaped expectations. Once chemical clarity was possible, natural fluctuations became unacceptable. Ordinary tiredness felt intolerable. The body's slower rhythms were perceived as defects. Cocaine raised the baseline against which all future states were judged. What had once been considered functional now felt dull. This recalibration was quiet but profound. Users did not feel reckless. They felt responsible. They were managing themselves to meet demands placed upon them. The drug's ability to maintain alertness reinforced the belief that constant readiness was achievable, and therefore expected. New York did not question whether perpetual alertness was humane. It admired those who achieved it. Cocaine thrived because it delivered exactly what the city praised. It sharpened without spectacle. It energized without obvious disorder. It allowed people to inhabit an idealized version of themselves, focused, composed, tireless. Only later would it become clear that this promise was incomplete. Alertness, divorced from rest, becomes brittle. Focus, sustained unnaturally, begins to fracture. But in this moment, the city saw only what it wanted to see, a substance that kept pace with ambition and asked nothing in return. At least, not yet. Cocaine's greatest protection was not secrecy, but cleanliness. It carried a name that sounded modern, orderly, precise. It belonged to chemistry rather than folklore, to laboratories rather than superstition. In an age eager to separate itself from the crude remedies of the past, this distinction mattered deeply. Substances that could be named, measured, and explained felt safe by default. The late 19th century placed immense faith in scientific language. Words like compound, solution, and extract reassured the public that chaos had been disciplined. Chemistry promised mastery over nature, not negotiation with it. Cocaine benefited from this trust immediately. It was presented as a product of method, not chance, of knowledge, not impulse. Medical journals discussed it with calm authority. Physicians wrote of its properties in measured tones, describing its effects on nerves and sensation as if cataloging machinery. There was no hint of alarm. Instead, there was admiration, Here was a substance that acted quickly, predictably, efficiently. It did not muddle the mind. It clarified it. It did not weaken the body. It fortified it. This clinical framing distanced cocaine from moral concern. Drugs associated with vice were spoken of in hushed tones, burdened with warnings and stigma. Cocaine escaped this category entirely. It wore the uniform of science, clean glass, Latin terminology, precise dosing. These details reassured both practitioners and patients that control was embedded in the substance itself. The era's reverence for progress amplified this effect. Scientific advancement was treated as moral advancement. To embrace modern chemistry was to align oneself with the future. Skepticism appeared backward, even irrational. Those who questioned new substances risked being labeled ignorant or fearful. Cocaine's critics, where they existed, found little audience. Pharmacists played a crucial role in cementing this trust. Their shops were orderly spaces, governed by regulation and ritual. Bottles were labeled, scales were calibrated, transactions were conducted with professionalism. Cocaine passed through these environments without disruption. It belonged there. Nothing about its presentation suggested danger. Patients, too, absorbed this confidence. When a physician recommended cocaine, it felt no different from any other modern intervention. The doctor's authority transformed chemical intervention into care. Relief became a sign of treatment working, not a signal to reconsider. Improvement validated the decision. The cleanliness extended beyond physical presentation. Cocaine's effects appeared tidy. There was no immediate disorientation, no loss of decorum. Users remained articulate, upright, composed. This reinforced the belief that the substance respected boundaries. It did not overwhelm, it assisted. The absence of visible chaos was mistaken for absence of risk. In this way, science functioned as camouflage. The drug's dangers were not hidden so much as unimagined. The framework through which cocaine was understood left little room for suspicion. If harm existed, it was assumed science would identify and correct it promptly. Until then, confidence prevailed. What no one fully considered was how limited early understanding truly was. Chemistry could isolate compounds, but it could not yet map long-term effects on the human nervous system. Medicine could observe immediate outcomes, but it struggled to anticipate cumulative consequences. The tools of the era were blunt compared to the confidence placed in them, yet confidence persisted. Cocaine's clean name protected it from scrutiny. It allowed use to expand without discomfort. Each successful application reinforced belief in its safety. The drug became embedded not just in practice, but in worldview. It symbolized the triumph of reason over limitation. By trusting the cleanliness of science, New York surrendered its caution. Drugs' legitimacy was secured not by evidence of safety, but by absence of immediate catastrophe. And in a city that prized forward motion above reflection, that absence was enough. Cocaine did not need to persuade. Science had already done the work for it. Authority in Gilded Age New York was rarely loud. It did not shout warnings or dramatize risk. It spoke softly, confidently, and with the assurance that everything was under control. Physicians embodied this tone perfectly. Their calm voices, steady hands, and measured language reassured patients long before any treatment was administered. When they spoke of cocaine, they did so without hesitation, and that absence of doubt mattered more than any written endorsement. Doctors occupied a unique position in the city's moral hierarchy. They were not merely healers, but interpreters of the modern body. Their judgments transformed discomfort into diagnosis, fatigue into condition, and chemistry into care. When cocaine entered their repertoire, it did so wrapped in professional confidence. It was discussed as a tool, not a temptation, a remedy, not a risk. Medical consultations followed a familiar ritual. Symptoms were described politely. Causes were suggested carefully. Solutions were offered decisively. Cocaine fit neatly into this structure. It was recommended to steady nerves, sharpen focus, reduce pain, and restore function. The doctor did not dwell on uncertainty. Uncertainty would have undermined trust. Instead, reassurance prevailed. The calmness with which cocaine was prescribed masked the novelty of its use. This was not a substance with generations of observed effects. Its long-term consequences were largely unknown, yet the medical profession's confidence suggested completeness of understanding. Patients assumed that what was offered had been thoroughly examined. The absence of warning implied safety. Physicians themselves were under pressure. New York demanded results. Patients wanted relief quickly, efficiently, without disruption to their lives. Cocaine delivered precisely that. It acted fast, it impressed, it reinforced the physician's authority by producing visible improvement. A patient who left alert and composed validated the doctor's judgment. Over time, this dynamic created a feedback loop. Successful outcomes encouraged continued use. Continued use normalized the drug's presence in medical practice. Normalization reduced scrutiny. Cocaine became routine, and routine in medicine often replaces caution. What distinguished cocaine from earlier remedies was its compatibility with professional identity. Doctors valued control over symptoms, over outcomes, over their own composure. Cocaine appeared controllable. It could be measured precisely. Its effects were predictable in the short term. It did not produce dramatic impairment. This aligned with the physician's desire to manage rather than overwhelm the body. The calm tone extended to written medical literature. Articles discussed cocaine's properties with restraint. Side effects, when mentioned, were framed as manageable or rare. There was no urgency in the language, no call for restraint. The implication was that science was proceeding appropriately, methodically, safely. Patients absorbed this calmness instinctively. They trusted the demeanor as much as the prescription. A doctor who spoke evenly signaled competence. The absence of alarm communicated reassurance. Cocaine's dangers, if they existed, were assumed to be known and accounted for. The patient's role was not to question, but to comply. This trust had consequences. When discomfort arose, restlessness, insomnia, nervous agitation, it was often attributed to the original condition rather than the treatment. The solution was adjustment, not cessation. A refined dose, a modified schedule. The drug remained central. The body was expected to adapt. In this way, medical authority did not merely introduce cocaine, it insulated it. Calm voices discouraged doubt. Professional certainty replaced individual judgment. The doctor's composure became a shield against suspicion. Only much later would this calm be reinterpreted as overconfidence. In the moment, it felt like progress. The doctor spoke softly. The patients improved, at least initially. And in a city that prized order and expertise, that was enough to silence concern. Cocaine did not spread through recklessness, it spread through reassurance. Cocaine did not force its way into New York society. It was invited. Its arrival was marked not by curiosity seekers or moral panic, but by acceptance that felt almost ceremonial. The substance crossed thresholds that other drugs never approached, entering drawing rooms, clinics, offices, and pharmacies without resistance. It did so because it arrived dressed correctly. Respectability in the Gilded Age was a matter of presentation as much as conduct. What was clean, labeled, and measured could be trusted. What was disorderly, improvised, or excessive could not. Cocaine aligned itself immediately with the former. It was packaged with care, dispensed with instruction, and discussed with restraint. There was nothing furtive about it, nothing that suggested indulgence. The respectable introduction depended on context. Cocaine was not encountered in isolation, but alongside authority. It appeared behind pharmacy counters staffed by trained professionals. It was recommended during consultations conducted in quiet offices. It was discussed in publications that spoke the language of science and progress. Each of these settings lent it legitimacy. In homes, its presence was discreet. It did not demand special preparation or ritual. A small amount could be incorporated into daily routine with minimal disruption. This was critical. Substances that required secrecy or dramatic behavior invited scrutiny. Cocaine required neither. It allowed the user to remain composed, productive, and socially acceptable. Social class played a decisive role. Cocaine's early adopters were not those already marked as suspicious. They were professionals, artists, and members of polite society. Their use did not threaten social order, it appeared to enhance it. When respected individuals used cocaine without visible consequence, the drug inherited their credibility. This inheritance worked quietly. No one announced that cocaine had been approved. Approval was inferred through absence of objection. It was present and no one protested. It was used and no scandal followed. This silence functioned as endorsement. Language reinforced this process. Cocaine was not discussed as intoxicating. It was described as stimulating, clarifying, fortifying. These words carried no moral weight. They suggested assistance, not excess. The drug's effects were framed as subtle and functional rather than overwhelming. It did not alter identity, it improved performance. Even leisure contexts preserved this respectability. Cocaine was not associated with revelry or abandonment. It was used to maintain composure during demanding evenings, to extend attention, to preserve wit. It helped individuals meet expectations placed upon them by social life itself. In this way, the drug became a tool of conformity rather than rebellion. What made this introduction especially effective was its invisibility. Cocaine did not announce itself through spectacle. It left no immediate mark. The user remained recognizably themselves. Friends and colleagues saw alertness, not alteration. The drug's presence faded into routine. This invisibility delayed suspicion. When problems emerged, restlessness, irritability, sleeplessness, they were rarely linked to cocaine. Such symptoms were easily attributed to the pressures of modern life. The city was exhausting. Everyone felt strained. Cocaine blended seamlessly into this narrative, appearing as response than cause. The respectable introduction also benefited from timing. New York was eager to believe that progress could solve the problems it created. Cocaine embodied this belief. It suggested that chemistry could compensate for overwork, overstimulation, and relentless pace. To reject it would have felt like rejecting modernity itself. Thus, cocaine settled into place without resistance. It did not arrive as a threat to be evaluated, but as a convenience to be accepted. Its respectability shielded it from early critique. By the time doubt surfaced, the drug was already woven into daily life. New York had welcomed cocaine politely, without drama or debate, and in doing so, it had ensured that when the consequences arrived, they would do so quietly as well. Measurement conveyed safety. In an age increasingly governed by numbers, scales, and schedules, anything that could be quantified inspired confidence. Cocaine benefited enormously from this faith. It was not taken in handfuls or swallowed blindly. It was weighed, divided, prescribed. Each dose was deliberate. Each measure suggested control. Pharmacists calibrated their scales with care. Physicians spoke in precise amounts. The language of dosage replaced the language of caution. A fraction of a gram, a carefully timed application. Such specificity reassured users that boundaries existed and were being respected. The substance itself seemed obedient to human intention. This emphasis on measurement shaped perception more than practice. People believed that as long as the dose was controlled, the effect would remain contained. Risk was imagined as a function of quantity rather than repetition. The idea that small amounts taken regularly could accumulate harm was not widely considered. What mattered was not how often, but how much. Cocaine fit neatly into this arithmetic. Its effects were immediate and proportional. A little produced clarity, a bit more produced vigor. The relationship felt predictable. This predictability reinforced the illusion of mastery. Users felt they were managing the substance rather than being shaped by it. Daily life adapted accordingly. Cocaine became another variable to be adjusted, like hours worked or tasks completed. A demanding morning required reinforcement. A long evening justified another measure. The drug was integrated into routine, not as an indulgence, but as maintenance. Its presence was accounted for, scheduled, normalized. The phrase measured dose carried moral weight. It implied restraint, responsibility, maturity. Those who adhered to proper amounts distinguished themselves from imagined excess. Addiction was something that happened to others, those without discipline or access to professional guidance. The measured user believed themselves protected by moderation. This belief extended to medical practice. Physicians adjusted doses in response to symptoms, not outcomes. If fatigue returned, the amount was modified. If restlessness emerged, the timing was altered. Rarely was cessation considered. Cocaine was not questioned, it was calibrated. The assumption was that the correct measure existed and that science would eventually identify it. Meanwhile, lives themselves became measured with similar rigidity. Time was segmented, productivity was tracked, social obligations were scheduled tightly. Cocaine supported this structure by smoothing transitions and sustaining output. It allowed individuals to meet quantified expectations without visible decline. What went unnoticed was how measurement narrowed perspective. Focus shifted to immediate effects and manageable variables. Long-term patterns were harder to see. The drug's influence unfolded gradually, below the threshold of alarm. Because each dose was small, its impact seemed insignificant. Because each day functioned, concern felt unnecessary. Yet repetition carries its own arithmetic. The body adapts. The nervous system recalibrates. What once produced clarity now merely prevents dullness. The measured dose becomes baseline rather than enhancement. Without announcement, the drug moves from optional to expected. Still, the ritual of measurement preserved confidence. Each careful preparation reinforced the belief that control remained intact. Users trusted the process even as their dependence deepened. The scale became a symbol of safety rather than a tool of caution. In this way, cocaine's danger was not excess but regularity. Its harm accumulated quietly, disguised by precision. The same discipline that governed its use prevented recognition of its cost. Lives were measured carefully, doses administered responsibly, and yet something essential slipped beyond calculation. Cocaine did not overwhelm New York through recklessness, it integrated itself through order. And in a city that trusted numbers more than intuition, that order proved persuasive enough to silence doubt, until measurement could no longer contain the consequences. Clarity was the commodity of the age. In a city thick with noise, motion, and competing demands, the promise of a clear mind carried immense appeal. Cocaine was marketed not as a stimulant in the crude sense, but as a purifier of thought. It promised to sweep away distraction, sharpen intention, and restore the sensation of mental command. In a world that prized decisiveness, this was irresistible. Advertisements and endorsements framed clarity as something that could be provided rather than cultivated. Where discipline and rest once played that role, chemistry now stepped in. Cocaine was presented as a modern solution to modern complexity. It could cut through fatigue, silence, mental clutter, and return the user to a state of productive focus. The implication was subtle but powerful. Clarity was no longer an internal achievement, it was a product. This shift altered how people understood their own minds. Difficulty concentrating was no longer seen as a signal to pause or reassess. It was a problem to be corrected. Cocaine offered correction efficiently. A dose could bring immediate sharpness. The fog lifted, thoughts aligned, tasks felt manageable again. The experience validated the belief that clarity had been restored, not artificially induced. The language of commerce reinforced this illusion. Bottles were labeled with claims of focus and vigor. Testimonials spoke of renewed precision. There was little mention of limitation. The product was framed as reliable, repeatable, and safe when used properly. Clarity, once ephemeral, had been stabilized for purchase. What made this especially persuasive was the drug's compatibility with self-image. Users did not feel altered, they felt corrected. The clarity they experienced felt like a return to their best selves. Cocaine did not introduce unfamiliar sensations, it intensified familiar ones. This continuity masked its influence. The mind felt sharper, but still recognizably one's own. As clarity became commodified, expectations shifted. The baseline for acceptable mental performance rose. Ordinary fluctuations in focus were no longer tolerated. A wandering mind felt like a malfunction. Cocaine filled the gap between human limitation and professional demand. It allowed individuals to meet expectations that were steadily increasing. This normalization carried consequences. Once clarity could be purchased, its absence felt inexcusable. People began to rely on the substance not only to enhance performance, but to maintain it. The drug became part of the infrastructure of daily life, as essential as lighting or transportation. Its use no longer required justification. Commerce further insulated cocaine from scrutiny. As long as the product sold and appeared effective, questions were postponed. Market success was mistaken for validation. If harm existed, it was assumed to be marginal or manageable. After all, clarity was being delivered as promised. Yet, bottled clarity is fragile. It depends on repetition. Each dose restores what the previous one diminished. The mind adapts to stimulation, requiring maintenance to feel normal. The clarity that once felt extraordinary becomes necessary just to function. This transition happens quietly, without the drama associated with intoxication. The city continued to praise sharpness and decisiveness. Cocaine continued to provide them, at a cost that remained invisible. Users did not feel reckless. They felt efficient. They believed they were purchasing clarity, not dependence. In commodifying clarity, New York surrendered its patience. The mind's natural rhythms were overridden by chemical certainty. Cocaine did not deceive through excess or indulgence. It convinced through usefulness, and in a city that valued results above reflection, that conviction proved dangerously durable. New York learned to reward those who stayed awake. Not merely awake in the literal sense, but alert, responsive, visibly engaged at all hours. The city applauded wakefulness as proof of devotion, to work, to progress, to the relentless idea that time must never be wasted. Sleep, when acknowledged at all, was treated as a private inconvenience rather than a public necessity. This attitude shaped behavior subtly but decisively. Those who arrived early and left late were praised. Those who answered correspondence without delay were admired. To be available was to be valuable. The city's rhythms left little space for withdrawal. Even nights were no longer an excuse. Gaslight extended the day and expectation followed it. In this environment, wakefulness acquired moral weight. To remain alert signaled commitment. To falter suggested deficiency. People learned to perform attentiveness even when it came at personal cost. Yawns were suppressed, weariness was concealed behind posture and habit. The city rewarded the appearance of endurance more than the reality of well-being. Cocaine found its most enthusiastic audience here. It supported a virtue the city already celebrated. It did not need to persuade anyone to stay awake. New York had already decided that sleep was negotiable. The drug merely provided the means. It allowed the body to comply with expectations that had outpaced its natural limits. What distinguished this era was not the presence of stimulants, but the absence of reprieve. There were no sanctioned pauses. The city's admiration was reserved for those who endured without complaint. Cocaine allowed users to meet this ideal quietly. They could remain attentive, efficient, and socially present long after fatigue would normally intervene. This applause reinforced behavior. Individuals who maintained wakefulness were rewarded with advancement, approval, and opportunity. Their success served as evidence that constant alertness was achievable. Others felt compelled to follow. Cocaine became not just an aid but a standard. To refuse it, or anything like it, risked falling behind. The culture of wakefulness extended beyond work. Social obligations demanded energy. Even leisure required engagement. One was expected to be interesting, responsive, and present regardless of the hour. Cocaine allowed individuals to fulfill these demands without visible strain. It preserved the illusion that the body was keeping pace willingly. The city did not recognize wakefulness as a state requiring recovery. It treated it as proof of resilience. This misunderstanding was crucial. Cocaine's ability to maintain alertness masked the accumulating cost. The mind stayed sharp, but the nervous system grew strained. The body complied, but at a price deferred. New York's applause drowned out quieter signals. Insomnia was reframed as productivity. Restlessness became ambition. The inability to sleep was not questioned, it was admired. Cocaine fit seamlessly into this narrative. It did not disrupt, it enabled. Over time, the city's expectations hardened. Wakefulness was no longer exceptional. It was assumed. Cocaine's role shifted accordingly. It was no longer enhancement but maintenance. The drug preserved a state the city had come to require. This applause had consequences. By celebrating wakefulness without acknowledging rest, New York created conditions where dependence could flourish unnoticed. Cocaine did not create the culture of endurance, it thrived within it. The city continued to applaud those who stayed awake. And cocaine ensured there would always be volunteers willing to do so, long after the applause should have faded. In Gilded Age New York, the apothecary was not merely a shop. It was a sanctuary of order in a city defined by motion. Glass cabinets stood aligned like pews. Bottles rested in careful rows, their labels precise, their contents sealed and disciplined. Light filtered through high windows, catching on polished counters and brass scales. Here, chemistry was not chaotic. It was reverent. To step inside an apothecary was to enter a space governed by trust. Every object suggested regulation. Every gesture implied restraint. The pharmacist's movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Powders were weighed with patience. Liquids were poured with care. Nothing about the setting invited recklessness. On the contrary, it assured the visitor that all within these walls was known, measured, and safe. Cocaine benefited enormously from this environment. It did not sit beside crude nostrums or questionable tonics. It was housed among remedies that carried the weight of professional approval. Its placement alone conferred legitimacy. If a substance belonged here, behind glass, under scale, dispensed by trained hands, it was assumed to be worthy of confidence. The apothecary embodied a broader cultural belief that science, properly arranged, could be trusted implicitly. Disorder signaled danger, order signaled control. Cocaine arrived impeccably ordered. It was labeled, cataloged, and sold according to protocol. There was no sense of transgression in acquiring it. The transaction felt responsible, even virtuous. Customers approached the counter not with hesitation, but expectation. They sought relief, restoration, efficiency. The apothecary delivered these promises quietly. No dramatic claims were made. No warnings were emphasized. The absence of alarm reinforced the impression that everything was proceeding as it should. Pharmacists themselves were gatekeepers of calm. Their authority rested not in spectacle, but in consistency. They did not lecture. They did not dramatize. They dispensed with composure. When they handed over cocaine, it felt no different from any other modern remedy. This sameness was powerful. It erased distinction. In many ways, the apothecary replaced older forms of spiritual assurance. Where churches once promised healing through faith, these spaces promised it through chemistry. The rituals were different, but the made comfort was similar. The bottle, like a relic, carried meaning beyond its contents. It represented progress, control, and the benevolence of modern knowledge. Cocaine's presence in this setting shielded it from moral scrutiny. Drugs associated with disorder were kept elsewhere, discussed in whispers or condemned outright. Cocaine, by contrast, was visible, normalized, respectable. Its danger was unimagined precisely because it was so well housed. This sanctification extended into the home. Bottles brought back from the apothecary carried the same aura of safety. They were stored carefully, used deliberately, trusted implicitly. The act of dosing felt like participation in a rational system. Measurement replaced intuition. Instruction replaced caution. What no one questioned was whether order alone could guarantee safety. The apothecary's cleanliness masked the limits of contemporary understanding. Science could isolate and distribute substances, but it could not yet foresee how repetition would reshape the nervous system. The temple inspired faith, not reflection. Thus, cocaine passed through New York's apothecaries without resistance. Each sale reinforced its legitimacy. Each measured dose affirmed the belief that control was absolute. The setting transformed chemistry into comfort. In the quiet sanctuaries of glass and scale, New York learned to trust cocaine not because it was harmless, but because it was housed where harm was never expected to dwell. Cocaine's position behind the counter was more than logistical. It was symbolic. To be kept there, out of reach yet fully visible, was to be granted legitimacy without inviting suspicion. The counter marked a boundary between chaos and order, between impulse and authorization. Substances placed behind it were assumed to be governed, supervised, and safe. In Gilded Age New York, few questioned what resided in that space. The counter was where knowledge stood between the public and potential harm. A customer did not reach, they requested. The pharmacist responded with judgment, not indulgence. This ritual transformed acquisition into permission. Cocaine was not taken, it was given. The visibility mattered. Cocaine was not hidden in drawers or exchanged discreetly. It was present, cataloged, acknowledged. Anyone could see it listed, measured, dispensed. This openness dissolved suspicion. What was dangerous was concealed. What was safe could be displayed. The act of purchase itself reinforced confidence. The customer described a need: fatigue, nerves, focus. The pharmacist selected the remedy with practiced ease. Scales were set, powder was portioned, instructions were offered calmly. The transaction felt clinical, procedural, and ordinary. Cocaine passed from one set of hands to another without drama. This ordinariness was crucial. It normalized the drug's presence. Cocaine became another item in the daily calculus of health and performance. Its acquisition carried no moral weight. There was no sense of crossing a line. The counter ensured that everything remained proper. Pharmacists rarely framed cocaine as exceptional. They did not linger on its novelty. Doing so might have invited questions. Instead, it was treated as a tool among others, distinguished only by its efficiency. Customers left reassured by this lack of emphasis. If it required no special explanation, it must require no special caution. Behind the counter, cocaine benefited from association. It shared space with substances that had long histories of use and acceptance. This proximity transferred trust. The public assumed that if cocaine belonged among these remedies, it had earned its place. What was absent from the exchange was discussion of duration. Cocaine was dispensed for immediate effect, not long-term consideration. The pharmacist addressed the present complaint, not future patterns. The question was not how often, but how much. The system was designed to manage quantities, not habits. Over time, this arrangement encouraged repetition. Customers returned as needs resurfaced. Each visit reinforced familiarity. The counter became a point of continuity. Cocaine's presence there signaled stability, not risk. Dependence could grow quietly under the guise of routine care. The physical barrier of the counter also created psychological distance. Responsibility seemed shared. The pharmacist had approved the substance. The customer had followed instruction. Any adverse effects felt less like consequence and more like misfortune, something to be adjusted rather than avoided. In this way, the counter did its work too well. It protected the public from reckless access, but also from questioning. Cocaine's placement behind it suggested that someone else had already asked the necessary questions and answered them. As New York's pace intensified, the counter facilitated adaptation. Cocaine remained available, respectable, and unchallenged. Each measured exchange strengthened its position within daily life. The powder behind the counter did not appear threatening. It appeared managed. And in a city that trusted management above all else, that appearance was enough. Nerves had once been treated as fragile things, signals of excess strain, signs that the body required retreat and restoration. In earlier years, nervous agitation invited rest, quiet, removal from pressure. But Gilded Age New York revised this understanding. Nerves were no longer warnings. They were resources to be refined. The city's pace transformed sensitivity into utility. A quickened response, a heightened awareness, a restless attentiveness. These were no longer liabilities. They were assets. The individual who reacted swiftly, noticed instantly, and remained perpetually alert was celebrated. Nervous energy, once feared, became desirable when properly directed. Medical language adapted accordingly. Physicians began to describe nervous conditions not solely as ailments, but as imbalances to be corrected. The goal was not calm, but control. Cocaine fit this objective precisely. It did not dull nerves into passivity. It sharpened them into compliance. The tremor was steadied, the agitation redirected. The individual returned to function. This reframing allowed cocaine to be positioned as a civilizing force. It did not eliminate nervousness, it disciplined it. The drug transformed diffuse unease into focused energy. Patients reported feeling capable rather than overwhelmed. Their nerves no longer interfered with productivity. They fueled it. Workplaces reinforced this transformation. Clerks under pressure, operators surrounded by constant noise, professionals managing endless demands, all learned to interpret nervous arousal as readiness. Cocaine supported this reinterpretation. It sustained the body in a state of heightened responsiveness without outward collapse. The individual appeared capable, composed, efficient. What was lost was the boundary between effort and strain. Nervousness ceased to function as a signal. It became background noise, something to be managed chemically rather than addressed structurally. Cocaine allowed people to remain in environments that exceeded human tolerance. The drug adjusted the individual to the system, not the system to the individual. This adjustment carried moral implications. Those who could channel their nerves were praised. Those who could not were seen as lacking discipline. Cocaine blurred the distinction between capacity and assistance. Success reinforced the belief that endurance was inherent rather than supported. The drug's role remained invisible. The transformation of nerves into productivity altered self-perception. Individuals no longer trusted their discomfort. Restlessness was interpreted as insufficient stimulation. Fatigue became a cue to intervene chemically rather than withdraw. Cocaine offered a way to convert internal resistance into external performance. Yet this conversion was incomplete. The nervous system paid a price for constant activation. Sleep became elusive. Irritability emerged. The mind remained alert long after the body required rest. These effects were often subtle, dismissed as side effects of modern life rather than consequences of intervention. New York's admiration for productivity ensured that these costs were ignored. As long as output remained high and composure intact, concern felt unnecessary. Cocaine delivered results. That was enough. In making nerves productive, the city sacrificed resilience for efficiency. Cocaine did not create this trade, it enabled it. The drug allowed New York to extract more from the human body without acknowledging the limits being crossed. The nervous system, once a guardian of balance, became an engine. And like all engines, it could be overrun, quietly, efficiently, and without immediate failure. Relief once implied surrender. To ease pain meant to withdraw, to lie down, to accept stillness while the body repaired itself. Sleep was part of the bargain. It was how discomfort resolved, how strain dissolved. But Gilded Age New York began to view this exchange as inefficient. The city did not object to relief. It objected to the pause that accompanied it. Cocaine offered a different arrangement. It promised mitigation without retreat. Pain could be quieted while the body remained upright. Sensation could be altered without the loss of alertness. This distinction transformed the meaning of care. Relief no longer required absence from duty. One could continue. Medical practice adapted quickly. Where older remedies dulled consciousness and enforced rest, cocaine preserved presence. Surgeons noted its capacity to numb without stupor. Physicians appreciated its ability to steady without sedating. Patients valued the way it allowed them to return immediately to obligation. Sleep, once essential, became optional. This was celebrated as progress. Pain without sleep suggested mastery over the body's demands. It implied that discomfort could be managed precisely without collateral inconvenience. The body was no longer permitted to insist on downtime. It was expected to cooperate. The implications were subtle but far-reaching. When pain no longer compelled rest, rest lost its legitimacy. Recovery became something that could be deferred indefinitely. Cocaine did not merely alleviate sensation, it altered expectation. The body's protests were muted, and with them, the justification for pause. Patients learned to accept this new arrangement readily. Relief that did not interfere with productivity felt ideal. One could attend meetings, perform tasks, maintain composure, all while discomfort was chemically restrained. The absence of sleepiness was interpreted as proof that nothing essential had been disrupted. Yet the body was not fooled. Pain suppressed without rest did not resolve. It accumulated. Tension lingered. Fatigue deepened. The nervous system remained engaged when it should have withdrawn. Cocaine made this possible by sustaining alertness even as the body's need for repair intensified. Doctors, too, adjusted their expectations. If pain could be managed without sedation, there was less reason to recommend rest. Treatment focused on immediate function rather than long-term balance. The patient's ability to continue became the measure of success. This shift aligned perfectly with New York's values. The city admired solutions that minimized interruption. Cocaine's ability to quiet pain without enforcing sleep made it indispensable. It preserved momentum, it prevented absence, it allowed life to proceed uninterrupted. But uninterrupted life exacts a cost. Sleep is not merely rest, it is restoration. By separating relief from rest, cocaine disrupted this cycle. The body's natural rhythms were overridden in favor of sustained engagement. Over time, this produced a quiet erosion, less visible than collapse, but more enduring. Insomnia emerged gradually. Nights shortened. Sleep became shallow, fragmented, elusive. These changes were rarely attributed to cocaine. They were blamed on stress, ambition, the city itself. Cocaine remained associated with relief, not disturbance. The promise of pain without sleep was seductive because it appeared compassionate. It spared the patient inconvenience. It respected their obligations. It seemed humane. In truth, it asked the body to endure without replenishment. New York embraced this promise eagerly. It valued solutions that preserved motion. Cocaine delivered exactly that. It allowed pain to be silenced without conceding time. And in doing so, it taught the city to ignore one of the body's most essential instructions: stop. What began as relief became deferral. What felt like control became dependence. And sleep, once a partner in healing, was quietly written out of the equation. In Gilded Age, New York, change was rarely announced as disruption. It was introduced as refinement, enhancement, correction. Words mattered. They softened risk and reassured conscience. Cocaine did not arrive as a radical intervention. It arrived wrapped in the careful vocabulary of improvement. Pamphlets, lectures, and professional discussions favored terms that suggested uplift rather than alteration. Cocaine was described as restorative, invigorating, clarifying. These were not the words of excess. They implied return to proper function. The substance was framed as a means of aligning the body with modern demands, not of pushing it beyond reason. This language shaped perception more effectively than any argument. To improve suggested that something had already fallen short. Fatigue, distraction, nervousness, these were cast as deviations from an ideal state. Cocaine promised to correct them. In doing so, it positioned itself as benevolent. One did not take cocaine to change who they were, but to become what they ought to be. Medical discourse reinforced this framing. Physicians spoke of optimizing performance, stabilizing nerves, enhancing focus. The body was treated as a system requiring adjustment. Cocaine became a tool of calibration. The goal was not comfort, but efficiency. Improvement implied direction: forward, upward, onward. The public absorbed this vocabulary eagerly. It resonated with a culture already convinced that modernity required constant self-betterment. To improve was to participate in progress. To refuse improvement felt regressive. Cocaine benefited from this moral alignment. Its use could be justified as responsible self-management. This language also minimized concern. Improvement sounded gentle. It suggested incremental change rather than transformation. Users did not imagine themselves engaging in something dangerous. They believed they were making small, sensible adjustments. The scale of intervention felt modest, even when repeated daily. What was obscured was the cumulative effect of continual improvement. Each correction assumed a stable baseline to return to. Cocaine altered that baseline quietly. What once felt improved soon felt normal. The absence of the drug then felt like decline. Improvement became maintenance. Maintenance became necessity. The language did not adapt to this shift. Cocaine continued to be discussed as enhancement even as dependence grew. The vocabulary lagged behind reality. Words like reliance or withdrawal were absent from polite discourse. They belonged to other substances, other people. This linguistic separation protected cocaine from association with danger. Addiction was framed as a moral failing or an exotic tragedy. Improvement was rational, controlled, respectable. Cocaine occupied the latter category comfortably. Even emerging side effects were interpreted through this lens. Restlessness became heightened engagement. Insomnia was attributed to ambition. Irritability was reframed as intensity. The language of improvement transformed warning signs into indicators of effort. New York's devotion to progress ensured that this vocabulary remained unchallenged. The city did not question tools that promised to keep pace. Cocaine's benefits were described in terms that aligned perfectly with prevailing values. It did not oppose the body, it disciplined it. It did not undermine character, it refined it. In truth, improvement without limits is erosion by another name. The body requires variation, effort and rest, focus and release. Cocaine's language erased these distinctions. It suggested that better was always possible, always desirable. By the time the language began to shift toward concern, caution, regulation, the habits it had enabled were already entrenched. Words had done their work. Cocaine had been welcomed not through deception, but through persuasion that sounded like progress. The city had learned to speak improvement fluently, and in doing so, it had taught itself not to hear the cost. Endorsement did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with routine. In Gilded Age, New York, professional approval was rarely dramatic. It was expressed through repetition, citation, and quiet inclusion. When a substance appeared consistently in lectures, journals, and consultations, it became part of accepted knowledge. Cocaine entered this circuit early and stayed. The authority of the professional class rested on distance. Physicians, surgeons, and pharmacists were expected to be measured, impartial, and restrained. Their credibility depended on appearing unswayed by fashion or novelty. When they adopted cocaine, they did so without fanfare, and that restraint communicated confidence. A thing that could be mentioned calmly must surely be understood. Medical journals discussed cocaine in tidy paragraphs, its properties listed alongside observations and modest claims. The tone was observational, not alarmed. Where uncertainty existed, it was framed as an invitation to further study rather than a cause for hesitation. This posture mattered. It suggested that any unknowns were manageable within the existing system of expertise. Endorsement also spread through teaching. Students encountered cocaine as part of a curriculum that emphasized modern methods and chemical precision. It was presented as a tool, useful, effective, and worthy of consideration. Young practitioners carried this knowledge into their practices, reproducing the same calm recommendations they had been taught. Thus, approval multiplied without debate. Hospitals and clinics reinforced the pattern. Cocaine appeared in formularies and protocols. Its inclusion signaled legitimacy. Substances deemed dangerous or dubious were excluded quietly. Cocaine's presence among accepted remedies suggested that it had passed necessary scrutiny. Few asked when that scrutiny had occurred or how thorough it had been. The professional endorsement extended beyond medicine. Dentists, ophthalmologists, and specialists of various kinds found uses for cocaine that seemed elegant and precise. Its versatility enhanced its reputation. A substance that served many disciplines appeared reliable by virtue of breadth. It was not a fringe remedy, it was adaptable. This diffusion of approval created insulation. When a patient encountered cocaine, it was rarely through a single voice. Multiple professionals echoed the same assurances. Consistency bred trust. If everyone agreed, doubt felt unnecessary. Individual skepticism dissolved in the presence of collective endorsement. Crucially, professional approval focused on immediate outcomes. Relief, focus, steadiness, these were observable and gratifying. Long-term patterns were harder to document and easier to postpone. The structure of professional validation favored what could be demonstrated quickly. Cocaine excelled under these conditions. The absence of overt harm reinforced endorsement further. Because early use rarely produced dramatic collapse, caution felt unwarranted. The professional class equated lack of crisis with safety. This assumption persisted longer than evidence justified. As endorsement accumulated, it altered social perception. Cocaine was no longer merely acceptable, it was validated. To use it was to align oneself with expert judgment. Refusal could even appear stubborn or uninformed. The authority of professionals transformed choice into expectation. Over time, endorsement hardened into orthodoxy. Cocaine's place in practice was no longer questioned because questioning would have implied prior error. Institutions resist such implications. It was easier to continue than to reconsider. When doubts eventually surfaced, they encountered resistance, not because evidence was lacking, but because endorsement had become identity. To challenge cocaine was to challenge the credibility of those who had supported it. Change, when it came, would be slow and reluctant. Professional endorsement did not guarantee safety, it guaranteed acceptance, and in a city that trusted expertise implicitly, that acceptance carried extraordinary power. Glass reassured. In Gilded Age New York, transparency carried moral weight. What could be seen, measured, and sealed appeared honest by design. Bottles mattered. Their clarity suggested purity. Their labels promised order. Cocaine, housed in clean glass and stoppered with care, inherited this visual innocence. There was comfort in watching a substance poured from a pristine container. It implied that nothing was hidden. The glass revealed texture and color, inviting inspection rather than secrecy. In an era suspicious of backroom dealings in adulterated goods, this mattered deeply. Cocaine's presentation allowed it to pass as trustworthy before it was ever tasted. The ritual of preparation further soothed conscience. A bottle removed from a cabinet. A stopper lifted. A measured amount dispensed. Each step was deliberate. There was no haste, no improvisation. The process felt rational. The user did not feel reckless. They felt careful. Care, in turn, implied responsibility. This visual cleanliness insulated cocaine from association with vice. Substances linked to disorder were imagined as murky, concealed, improvised. Cocaine was none of these. It looked controlled. It behaved predictably. It fit comfortably into environments that valued decorum. The glass bottle functioned as both container and alibi. Moral reassurance extended beyond appearance. The act of using cocaine did not require secrecy. Bottles could sit openly on shelves or desks without attracting comment. Their presence suggested legitimacy. No one whispered about what was plainly displayed. Visibility became protection. This openness shaped self-perception. Users did not feel they were engaging in questionable behavior. They believed they were participating in modern care. The clean glass reflected back an image of rationality. It allowed individuals to see themselves as disciplined, not dependent. Even when discomfort arose, the container remained blameless. A restless night could be attributed to stress. Irritability could be blamed on pressure. The bottle, still clear and orderly, seemed incapable of causing harm. Its appearance contradicted any suspicion. Pharmacists and physicians relied on this symbolism, knowingly or not. They understood that presentation influenced trust. Clean glass communicated precision. It aligned with the broader narrative of scientific progress. Cocaine's housing made it feel like an extension of laboratory practice rather than a departure from it. This visual morality delayed ethical reckoning. When concerns eventually emerged, they struggled to attach themselves to something so carefully packaged. Danger is easier to imagine when it looks dangerous. Cocaine did not. Its cleanliness deflected doubt. The conscience, like the eye, is susceptible to reassurance. When no stain appears, no stain is assumed. Cocaine's glass containers preserved not only the substance, but the belief that it was being used properly. That belief endured long after evidence began to challenge it. In a city that trusted appearances as much as outcomes, clean glass proved persuasive. It allowed New York to consume cocaine without confronting unease. The conscience remained clear until cracks appeared not in the bottle, but in the lives it quietly shaped. Cocaine did not remain confined to professional spaces for long. Its migration was gradual, almost imperceptible, carried not by enthusiasm but by familiarity. What began in clinics and consulting rooms soon crossed into private life, following the same calm logic that had justified its medical use. If it was safe under a doctor's supervision, it could surely be safe at home. This transition did not feel like expansion, it felt like convenience. Patients who had first encountered cocaine during treatment began to keep it nearby. A bottle placed discreetly in a drawer or cabinet seemed practical, even prudent. Why return to the clinic for something so easily administered? The substance was already known. Its effects were familiar. Its legitimacy had been established. Parlors, like apothecaries, were spaces of respectability. They were curated environments where appearance and conduct mattered deeply. Cocaine's entry into these rooms signaled its full assimilation into polite society. It did not disrupt conversation or demand explanation. It sat quietly among other modern comforts, its presence unremarkable. In these domestic settings, cocaine's use broadened subtly. It was no longer reserved for specific complaints. It became a general aid, a means of maintaining composure during long visits, sustaining energy through demanding evenings, or restoring clarity after fatigue set in. The line between treatment and routine blurred without announcement. Social reinforcement accelerated this process. When hosts used cocaine discreetly and appeared composed, guests took note. The substance did not produce spectacle. It preserved decorum. This mattered. In a culture that valued restraint, cocaine's invisibility made it acceptable. Its effects were felt, not displayed. The domestic setting also altered patterns of use. Without the formal structure of clinical oversight, dosage became more flexible. Instructions were remembered rather than consulted. Adjustments were made intuitively. The ritual remained careful, but the context was less controlled. Familiarity bred confidence, and confidence invited repetition. Importantly, cocaine's presence in parlors carried no stigma. It was not discussed as indulgence. It was treated as a private aid, a matter of personal management. Guests did not inquire. Hosts did not explain. Silence preserved respectability. This silence allowed habits to form unnoticed. In the absence of external observation, reliance could deepen without interruption. The substance's role expanded quietly, responding to demands that were social rather than medical. Fatigue from conversation, pressure from expectation, strain from performance, all found relief in the same measured dose. The parlor setting also softened the perception of risk. Surrounded by familiar comforts, cocaine felt benign. It was no longer associated with illness or intervention. It became part of the domestic rhythm. This normalization was powerful. It erased the sense that one was using a drug at all. New York's homes absorbed cocaine without resistance because it matched the era's values. It preserved appearance. It sustained engagement. It avoided disruption. The drug did not challenge domestic order. It reinforced it. By the time cocaine's presence in private life became widespread, it no longer seemed noteworthy. It had completed its journey from clinic to parlor without ever raising alarm. The transition was seamless because the logic remained consistent. A modern substance for a modern life, used carefully, quietly, and without question. What was lost in this migration was perspective. The clinic had at least implied purpose and limitation. The parlor implied comfort and continuity. Cocaine's role shifted accordingly, from remedy to companion. And companions, unlike treatments, are rarely examined too closely until they begin to misbehave. Reliance rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with urgency or alarm. It settles gently, disguised as preference, convenience, habit. In Gilded Age New York, cocaine did not seize its users. It accompanied them. It became present in moments that felt ordinary, necessary, even sensible. By the time reliance emerged, it felt less like a change than a continuation. The earliest signs were subtle. A day felt longer than expected. Attention wavered. Sooner. Fatigue arrived without invitation. These sensations were not new. They were the natural responses of a taxed body. What was new was the response to them. Where rest or retreat might once have followed, Cocaine now offered an alternative, immediate, effective, familiar. At first, its use remained occasional, a measure taken after an unusually demanding day, a dose reserved for particularly trying engagements. These moments felt justified. They reinforced the belief that cocaine was being used judiciously in response to genuine need. Gradually, the definition of need shifted. Days became uniformly demanding. Social expectations intensified. The city's pace left little room for variation. Cocaine's assistance, once exceptional, became reassuring. The user did not crave it in the dramatic sense. They simply preferred the day with it to the day without. This preference was rarely examined. There was no obvious harm to provoke concern. Life continued. Obligations were met. Appearances were maintained. Cocaine's presence faded into the background, its absence becoming more noticeable than its use. Reliance developed through anticipation rather than desperation. Users began to plan for cocaine's presence. A bottle placed where it could be reached easily. A dose timed to coincide with known demands. These arrangements felt practical, not compulsive. They signaled preparedness rather than need. The body adapted quietly. What cocaine had once enhanced now simply preserved. The clarity it provided became the baseline against which all other states were judged. Without it, the day felt dull, effortful, less manageable. This contrast was interpreted as deficiency rather than dependence. Importantly, reliance remained invisible to others. Cocaine did not announce itself through disorder. The user remained composed, productive, socially present. There was no external pressure to reconsider. Friends and colleagues saw only competence. Medical language offered little guidance here. Dependence was associated with visible excess, not quiet regularity. Cocaine's users did not fit the prevailing image of addiction. They were disciplined, informed, respectable. The term did not apply to them, or so they believed. This invisibility was reinforced by routine. Daily repetition dulled awareness. The act of dosing became as unremarkable as any other habit. There was no sense of crossing a threshold. Each day resembled the last. Reliance grew in increments too small to register. The city itself encouraged this progression. New York did not slow to accommodate human limits. It rewarded those who adapted. Cocaine enabled adaptation without protest. To rely on it felt rational, even necessary within this environment. By the time reliance became undeniable, when absence produced discomfort, when sleep grew elusive, when nerves refused to settle, the habit was already entrenched. Even then, the response was adjustment, not withdrawal. A different timing, a refined amount. Reliance was managed, not named. The first quiet reliance did not feel like loss of control. It felt like continuity. Cocaine did not disrupt life, it sustained it. And that, more than any dramatic effect, ensured its hold. New York did not notice the moment when assistance became requirement. It happened without ceremony, without warning, and without witness, except in the bodies that had learned to depend on a substance that once promised nothing more than help. Cocaine's most persuasive quality was not the energy it supplied, but the silence it enforced. It did not ask the body to stop. It did not insist on withdrawal or surrender. Where fatigue traditionally negotiated through heaviness and sleep, cocaine bypassed the conversation entirely. The body was allowed, encouraged to continue. This was its true compatibility with Gilded Age New York. The city had no patience for interruption. Rest was inconvenient, unpredictable, unproductive. Cocaine aligned perfectly with this ethos by offering endurance without complaint. It did not argue with schedules. It did not respect limits. It simply removed the sensation that limits existed. Other remedies carried conditions. Alcohol dulled judgment. Opiates invited sleep. Even stimulants of earlier generations produced agitation that eventually forced collapse. Cocaine felt different. Its clarity was clean, its wakefulness orderly. It kept the mind engaged while convincing the body that it was capable of more. This absence of resistance was seductive. Users did not feel they were overriding themselves. They felt supported. The drug seemed to cooperate with ambition rather than challenge it. One could work through discomfort without drama. One could extend the day without visible cost. Sleep under this arrangement became optional. not unnecessary, but deferrable. Nights shortened quietly. Rest was postponed rather than abandoned. The body learned to accept interruption. Cocaine filled the space where sleep should have insisted. Medical reassurance reinforced this behavior. If a substance could relieve strain without sedating, why not use it? Sleep was reframed as a passive state, something to be minimized rather than protected. Cocaine enabled a new ideal, recovery without withdrawal. This ideal carried consequences that were not immediately visible. Sleep is not merely rest, it is regulation. It repairs nerves, consolidates memory, restores balance. Cocaine's refusal to demand sleep disrupted these processes subtly. The mind remained alert, but the nervous system grew unstable. Irritability crept in, focus sharpened unevenly. The body functioned, but at a cost deferred. New York did not notice these early signs. The city valued output, not equilibrium. As long as individuals remained present and productive, concern felt unnecessary. Cocaine delivered exactly that. It sustained appearance while undermining resilience. Over time, the absence of rest became normalized. Insomnia was explained away as modern strain. Fatigue was attributed to effort rather than imbalance. Cocaine remained framed as solution, not contributor. The drug's silence about rest masked its role in eroding it. The danger lay in continuity. Cocaine did not force a reckoning. It allowed the body to adapt incrementally to a state of perpetual engagement. The nervous system learned to remain activated. Sleep became shallow, fragmented, unreliable. Yet life continued. That continuity reassured users that nothing was fundamentally wrong. A drug that never demanded rest fit seamlessly into a city that refused it. Cocaine did not create New York's intolerance for pause. It simply made it sustainable, for a time. By the end of this phase, cocaine's role was secure. It was no longer a novelty or an aid. It was infrastructure. It supported a way of living that denied the body's need to stop. And because it did so quietly, without spectacle or collapse, its danger remained unspoken. The city continued to move, the nights continued to shorten, and cocaine, faithful to its promise, asked nothing of the body except that it keep going. Society prized effortlessness above all else. To appear composed, energized, and attentive without visible strain was the highest form of refinement. In Gilded Age, New York, women were expected to embody this ideal flawlessly. They were not permitted the open fatigue of labor or the acknowledged exhaustion of ambition. Their tiredness, if it existed at all, was meant to remain invisible. Cocaine entered this expectation quietly. It did not announce itself as liberation or rebellion. It presented as assistance, subtle, discreet, compatible with decorum. For women navigating the exacting rituals of social life, this mattered deeply. The drug did not disrupt appearance, it preserved it. A lady who did not yawn was admired. A lady who never seemed weary was elevated. Social. Calendars were relentless. Afternoon calls bled into evening dinners, which extended into late salons and performances. Conversation demanded alertness. Listening required patience. Wit was expected on command. There was little allowance for withdrawal. Fatigue threatened embarrassment. Cocaine offered protection. The substance's invisibility made it ideal. It did not redden the eyes or loosen speech. It sharpened attention without betraying effort. A woman could sit upright, engaged, responsive, even when the day had stretched beyond comfort. This composure was interpreted as natural grace rather than chemical support. Importantly, cocaine's use in these circles carried no sense of impropriety. It was not discussed openly, but neither was it condemned. Silence functioned as approval. If respected women used it without scandal, the substance inherited their respectability. The pressure to maintain this composure was not merely social, it was moral. A woman's appearance reflected not only herself, but her household. Fatigue suggested mismanagement. Cocaine allowed expectations to be met without visible compromise. It preserved the illusion of ease that society demanded. This preservation came at a cost that remained unspoken. Sleep shortened, rest became fragmented, nervous tension accumulated beneath calm surfaces. Yet these effects were dismissed as part of modern life. Cocaine's role was obscured by the very grace it sustained. Over time, the standard hardened. Once constant alertness was achieved, it became expected. Women who faltered were judged. Cocaine's assistance, once optional, grew quietly essential. The drug did not grant freedom, it enforced conformity. The ladies who did not yawn were praised for their endurance. Their composure was admired. Few asked what sustained it. Cocaine ensured that the question did not need to be answered, at least not yet. Endurance became a mark of seriousness. In Gilded Age New York, a man's worth was increasingly measured by how long he could remain at his desk, his ledger, his negotiations without visible decline. To work late was admirable. To work endlessly suggested mastery, not only over one's profession, but over oneself. Cocaine fit neatly into this ideal. It did not announce indulgence or escape. It presented as reinforcement. The drug allowed men to extend the working day without acknowledging strain. Fatigue could be postponed, focus could be sharpened. The mind remained engaged long after the body would ordinarily insist on retreat. Business culture encouraged this transformation. Offices buzzed late into the evening. Correspondents demanded prompt replies. Markets moved faster, and opportunity favored those who remained attentive. The gentlemen who worked longer appeared committed, disciplined, indispensable. Cocaine offered a means to sustain this appearance without complaint. Unlike alcohol, which dulled judgment, cocaine preserved clarity, at least initially. It allowed calculations to continue, arguments to be refined, decisions to be made with apparent precision. This distinction mattered. The drug did not undermine authority, it reinforced it. A man could remain sharp, decisive, in control. The language surrounding such endurance was flattering. Long hours were framed as dedication. Sleepless nights became evidence of ambition. Cocaine's assistance was absorbed into this narrative seamlessly. It did not disrupt masculinity, it amplified it. The user did not feel dependent, he felt capable. Over time, however, the standard shifted. Once longer hours became possible, they became expected. The baseline for acceptable performance rose quietly. Men who could not sustain this pace were judged lacking. Cocaine's role remained invisible, its assistance mistaken for innate stamina. This invisibility protected the habit. A gentleman did not admit reliance, he managed himself. Cocaine's discreet effects allowed this self-image to persist. The drug did not demand acknowledgement, it simply enabled continuation. As days lengthened, nights shortened. Sleep became fragmented, often postponed in favor of productivity. Cocaine ensured that this postponement felt manageable. The body's protests were muted. Irritability, restlessness, and tension were interpreted as the price of success rather than signals of imbalance. The professional environment rewarded this interpretation. Advancement favored those who appeared tireless. Cocaine helped men meet expectations that had quietly exceeded human limits. The drug did not create ambition. It facilitated its expression beyond sustainable bounds. Eventually, the cost surfaced. Focus grew uneven. Patience thinned. The nervous system remained activated long after work concluded. Yet the response was not withdrawal. It was adjustment, another measure, a refined schedule. Cocaine remained the solution to the problems it increasingly contributed to. Gentlemen, who worked longer, were praised for their resolve. Their endurance was admired. Few asked what sustained it. Cocaine allowed the question to remain unspoken, its answer concealed beneath polished desks and late-burning lamps. The city applauded those who stayed late. Cocaine ensured there would always be men willing to do so, until endurance itself became a liability rather than a virtue. Creation had always demanded sacrifice, but Gilded Age New York refined the terms. Inspiration was no longer allowed to wander at its own pace. Deadlines tightened, patrons waited, audiences expected novelty without delay. The artist was asked not only to imagine, but to produce, steadily, visibly, and on command. Sleep, once a companion to vision, became an obstacle to be negotiated. Cocaine entered studios and rehearsal rooms without fanfare. It did not arrive as muse or madness, it arrived as focus. The drug promised a narrowing of attention, a sharpening of intent. Where? Fatigue blurred outlines and dulled sensation. Cocaine restored edges. The mind felt precise, the hand steadied, the hour stretched. For painters, writers, composers, and performers, this clarity was intoxicating in its restraint. It did not flood the senses, it disciplined them. Cocaine allowed work to continue through the long hours when ideas usually faltered. The artist could remain seated, upright, attentive, even as night pressed against the windows. The city admired this endurance and mistook it for devotion. The myth of the sleepless artist flourished easily. Insomnia was reframed as commitment. Restlessness became intensity. Cocaine did not contradict these myths. It made them sustainable. One could refuse sleep and still function. One could deny the body's demands without immediate consequence. The work progressed. That seemed proof enough. In this environment, the boundary between inspiration and stimulation blurred. Ideas arrived quickly, sharply, insistently. The mind leapt from thought to thought with exhilarating speed. Cocaine seemed to open channels rather than create them. Artists believed they were accessing a truer, more efficient version of themselves. The drug felt like a facilitator, not an intruder. Yet the cost of this efficiency was subtle. Work produced under sustained stimulation often lacked the patience that sleep affords. Revision shortened, reflection thinned. The pause that allows judgment to mature was sacrificed to momentum. Cocaine rewarded immediacy. It favored output over incubation. The city did not object. New York valued novelty and speed. Audiences consumed rapidly and demanded more. Patrons rewarded productivity. Cocaine allowed artists to meet these demands without withdrawing from the rhythm of the city. Sleep, with its insistence on silence and surrender, felt indulgent by comparison. As nights accumulated, the nervous system adapted. Sleep became shallow or elusive. Dreams fragmented. The mind remained alert long. After the body sought rest, cocaine's presence made this state feel workable. The artist did not collapse. They continued. That continuity reassured them that nothing essential had been lost, but something had shifted. The work began to depend on stimulation to begin at all. The blank page felt heavier without chemical clarity. The silence before sleep grew uncomfortable. Cocaine moved from aid to prerequisite without ceremony. This dependence remained invisible to observers. The artist still produced. The work still circulated. Applause continued. Cocaine's role was concealed by success. No one questioned the cost as long as the result arrived on time. In refusing sleep, artists surrendered a form of restoration that no stimulant could replace. Sleep does not merely rest the body. It integrates experience, tempers impulse, and restores proportion. Cocaine allowed work to continue without these processes. The result was sustained effort without renewal. The city celebrated the artists who would not sleep. Their productivity fed the myth of relentless creativity. Cocaine ensured the myth could endure long enough to obscure the quiet erosion beneath it. Performance in Gilded Age. New York did not conclude with applause. It extended long after the curtain fell, into receptions, conversations, and expectations that demanded continued presence. The performer was not permitted to disappear once the role ended. Energy was required not only on stage but afterward, alert, gracious, engaged. The night did not end simply because the body wished it to. Cocaine answered this demand with remarkable efficiency. It allowed performers to sustain vitality beyond the natural arc of exertion. Muscles steadied. Breath remained controlled. The mind stayed sharp even as fatigue pressed quietly beneath the surface. The drug did not interfere with timing or coordination. On the contrary, it preserved them. This distinction mattered profoundly in a profession where precision was visible and error unforgiving. The endless night was not accidental. New York's theaters, concert halls, and salons operated on a schedule that assumed endurance. Performers were expected to move seamlessly from rehearsal to performance, from performance to social obligation, from social obligation to preparation for the next day. Sleep became fragmented, interrupted, postponed. Cocaine made this postponement feel manageable. Unlike alcohol, which dulled reflex and judgment, cocaine preserved alertness. It allowed performers to remain responsive, attentive, and composed. The drug did not blur the line between role and self, it reinforced it. One could remain professional without visible strain. This reinforced the belief that endurance was a matter of discipline rather than support. Audiences and patrons admired this stamina. The performer who appeared tireless was praised as devoted. The effort required to sustain such composure remained invisible. Cocaine's assistance ensured that invisibility persisted. The body's limits were masked by chemical compliance. Over time, the rhythm of the endless night reshaped expectation. Once performers demonstrated that they could endure extended hours, they were expected to do so routinely. Cocaine's role shifted from enhancement to requirement. The absence of rest became normalized. Fatigue was interpreted as lack of professionalism rather than a signal to pause. The nervous system adapted accordingly. Sleep shortened. Rest became shallow. The body learned to remain activated long after performance ended. Cocaine filled the gap left by recovery. It did not restore, it sustained. This distinction was rarely acknowledged. Behind the scenes, tension accumulated, irritability surfaced, focus sharpened unevenly. The calm maintained on stage required increasing effort. Cocaine's effects felt necessary just to preserve equilibrium. Yet the performer remained functional. Applause continued. The system appeared to work. The endless night rewarded continuity above all else. Cocaine ensured continuity without collapse. It allowed the performer to meet demands that exceeded human rhythm. The cost was deferred, hidden beneath professionalism and routine. New York applauded those who endured the longest. Cocaine ensured there would always be performers willing to do so, until endurance itself became unsustainable, and the night demanded payment it had long postponed. The modern day was not built for pause. It was assembled from ledgers, schedules, and the steady percussion of keys striking paper. In Gilded Age, New York, clerks and typists occupied the engine rooms of progress, offices where attention was currency and error carried consequence. Their labor was quiet, continuous, and exacting. It demanded not inspiration, but endurance. Cocaine entered these rooms without drama. It did not arrive as novelty or indulgence. It appeared as accommodation. The work required sustained focus under artificial light, hours bent over figures that refused forgiveness. Fatigue dulled precision. A lapse of attention could undo a day's effort. Cocaine promised to hold the mind steady against this attrition. The clerical world prized regularity. Days began on time and extended as needed. Lunch was brief. Breaks were discouraged. The expectation was simple: remain alert. Cocaine aligned with this mandate perfectly. It sharpened attention without disrupting decorum. The typist's fingers continued their rhythm. The clerk's eyes tracked columns without wavering. The body complied. Unlike artists or performers, clerks did not cloak their endurance in myth. Their virtue was reliability. Cocaine did not transform their work, it preserved it. The drug kept pace with the mechanical demands of the office, reinforcing the belief that modern labor required modern assistance. The environment itself encouraged this reliance. Offices were designed for efficiency, not comfort. Chairs were rigid, air was stale, light was constant. These conditions taxed the nervous system subtly, day after day. Cocaine mitigated the strain without altering the setting. The individual adapted. The structure remained unchanged. Supervisors praised accuracy and speed. Those who maintained both were rewarded. Cocaine's role in sustaining performance went unmentioned. The clerk appeared competent, the typist tireless. The drug's invisibility allowed success to be attributed to character rather than chemistry. Over time, the baseline shifted. What had once been exceptional focus became expected. Cocaine's assistance, once occasional, grew routine. The absence of the drug revealed how much had changed. Without it, the day felt longer, the work heavier, the mind less obedient. This contrast was interpreted as personal deficiency rather than chemical dependence. The modern day tolerated no deviation. Deadlines did not adjust to human rhythm. Cocaine ensured compliance. It allowed clerks and typists to meet demands that quietly exceeded sustainable limits. Sleep shortened. Evenings blurred into preparation for the next morning. The drug filled the gap left by rest. Medical language offered reassurance. Small doses, properly measured, were deemed safe. The absence of immediate crisis reinforced confidence. The work continued. That continuity was mistaken for health. In these offices, cocaine became infrastructure. It supported a system that demanded constant attentiveness. The clerks and typists did not seek exhilaration. They sought stability. Cocaine delivered it, temporarily. The modern day rewarded those who adapted without complaint. Cocaine made adaptation possible. It did not announce its presence. It simply kept the keys moving, the numbers aligned, the hours extending, and in doing so, it bound an entire class of workers to a rhythm that never paused to ask whether it should. Discretion was not merely etiquette, it was instruction. In Gilded Age, New York, the ability to conceal effort was treated as proof of refinement. One did not display strain, one managed it privately. This expectation shaped behavior as powerfully as any rule, and cocaine adapted to it with remarkable ease. The drug did not advertise itself. It did not demand explanation or apology. Its effects were quiet, internal, controlled. This suited a culture that valued self-command above confession. To rely openly on anything was to risk appearing weak. Cocaine allowed reliance without disclosure. Discipline, in this context, meant maintaining appearances regardless of internal cost. The body could tremble, tire, or protest, but none of this was meant to surface. Cocaine's assistance operated beneath the threshold of visibility. The user remained composed. The day proceeded. No one needed to know. This invisibility reinforced the belief that cocaine was not a crutch, but a tool of self-regulation. Discretion transformed dependence into discipline. The act of dosing felt like management rather than surrender. The user believed they were exercising control, not relinquishing it. Social norms rewarded this behavior. Those who managed strain quietly were admired. Those who faltered publicly were judged. Cocaine enabled the former and prevented the latter. It allowed individuals to meet expectations without exposing vulnerability. The culture of discretion discouraged reflection. Questions were impolite. Inquiry suggested doubt. Cocaine thrived in this silence. Its role remained unexamined precisely because it did not disrupt order. The drug did its work without forcing conversation. Medical authority reinforced discretion. Physicians rarely dramatized risk. They spoke calmly, adjusted doses, and advised moderation. There was no language for discussing quiet dependence. Addiction, when acknowledged, was associated with excess and spectacle. Cocaine's users did not fit this image. Their discipline protected them from the label. As a result, habits deepened unnoticed. Reliance grew behind closed doors and polite smiles. Cocaine became part of personal management, as routine as grooming or scheduling. The discipline lay not in abstention, but in concealment. This concealment carried a cost. Without acknowledgement, there could be no correction. The body's signals were ignored. Fatigue was managed rather than addressed. Rest was postponed indefinitely. Cocaine allowed this postponement to continue without immediate collapse. New York prized discretion because it preserved order. Cocaine supported this priority perfectly. It kept lives functioning smoothly while quietly eroding resilience. The discipline it fostered was one of endurance, not balance. By the time discretion began to fail, when nerves frayed visibly, when sleep disappeared, when control slipped, the habit was already entrenched. The silence that had protected cocaine now protected its consequences. Discretion had been mistaken for strength. Cocaine had been mistaken for discipline, and in a city that valued composure above all else, that confusion persisted far longer than it should have. Uprightness became an expectation rather than a posture. In Gilded Age New York, the body was required to present itself as willing, straight-backed, alert, responsive, regardless of the strain accumulating beneath the surface. To sag was to confess weakness, to lean was to suggest delay. Cocaine's quiet promise was that the body could be kept upright long after it would have chosen otherwise. The city's architecture reinforced this demand. Desks stood tall, counters were rigid, stages and platforms elevated those who endured. Chairs were narrow and unforgiving. The body was not invited to relax, it was instructed to perform. Cocaine cooperated with this instruction faithfully. It steadied limbs, sharpened attention, and muted the signals that usually precede collapse. What distinguished this chemical assistance was its subtlety. The body did not feel forced, it felt assisted. Muscles obeyed, breath remained even, the mind stayed present. Uprightness felt natural, earned even, rather than imposed. This illusion mattered. It allowed endurance to masquerade as strength. Over time, the expectation of uprightness extended beyond work into identity. To be capable was to remain standing, figuratively and literally. Those who required rest were quietly sidelined. Cocaine allowed individuals to avoid this fate. It kept them in circulation, visible and viable, long after their reserves had thinned. The nervous system bore the burden. It remained engaged without relief. Signals of fatigue were dampened rather than answered. The body learned to comply in the absence of recovery. Cocaine made this compliance feel sustainable. Days blurred into one another, each supported by the same quiet intervention. Medical reassurance supported the posture. If the body remained upright, the treatment was deemed successful. There was little incentive to question the means. Function replaced well-being as the measure of health. Cocaine excelled under this metric. It delivered posture without restoration. This emphasis on uprightness altered how discomfort was interpreted. Back pain, tension, and restlessness were accepted as incidental. The ability to remain standing mattered more than the condition of standing itself. Cocaine preserved the appearance of capability even as the structure supporting it weakened. New York admired those who did not falter. The city rewarded presence. Cocaine ensured presence could be maintained. It did not heal. It sustained. The distinction was rarely acknowledged. As long as the body stayed upright, concern felt unnecessary. Eventually, uprightness became brittle. Small disruptions caused disproportionate strain. Sleep no longer restored posture. Restlessness replaced ease. The body remained upright through effort rather than resilience. Cocaine compensated, again, quietly. The cost of this arrangement was deferred, not avoided. The body can be kept upright for a time through chemical insistence, but posture without recovery is a debt. It accumulates interest invisibly. New York continued to demand upright bodies. Cocaine continued to provide them. And between expectation and compliance, the body learned a new lesson. Standing was mandatory, even when it should have been allowed to lie down. The most reliable symptom was quiet, not the absence of sensation, but the absence of conversation. In Gilded Age New York, the effects that followed cocaine's steady use were rarely named aloud. They appeared gradually, indistinctly, and without ceremony, easy to ignore, easier to rationalize. Silence became the condition that allowed them to persist. Side effects did not arrive as crises. They slipped in as inconveniences. Sleep shortened by an hour. Appetite lost its regularity. Irritation surfaced where patience once lived. Thoughts raced when stillness was required. None of this seemed alarming in a city already strained by pace and noise. The symptoms blended into the background of modern life. This blending protected cocaine from scrutiny. When discomfort arose, it was attributed to work, ambition, stress, the city itself. New York was exhausting. Everyone knew that. Cocaine's role was obscured by context. The drug remained framed as solution rather than contributor. Medical discourse offered little language for quiet consequences. The profession was attuned to acute reactions, dramatic failures, visible collapse. Cocaine rarely produced these in its early stages. Its effects accumulated below the threshold of alarm. The absence of catastrophe was interpreted as evidence of safety. Patients, too, struggled to articulate what they felt. The changes were subtle and inconsistent. One night of poor sleep did not suggest danger. A short temper could be excused. Restlessness could be reframed as energy. Without clear markers, concern dissipated. The culture of discretion reinforced this silence. Complaints implied weakness. Admitting discomfort risked judgment. Cocaine users had learned to manage strain privately. Side effects were managed the same way, quietly, internally, without challenge. This silence extended into social spaces. Irritability was masked by politeness. Insomnia was hidden behind punctuality. Anxiety was concealed beneath composure. Cocaine's users remained functional, and functionality was the city's only standard. Over time, these quiet effects compounded. Sleep deprivation weakened resilience. Constant stimulation frayed nerves. Focus sharpened unevenly, producing bursts of clarity followed by fog. The body adapted to a state of perpetual readiness without restoration. Yet life continued. That continuity reassured everyone involved. The absence of discussion delayed recognition. Without shared language, patterns remained individual rather than collective. Each person assumed their experience was unique, manageable, temporary. Cocaine's widespread influence remained fragmented into private discomforts rather than public concern. Eventually, the silence became unsustainable. Symptoms intensified, sleep vanished, anxiety sharpened into agitation, focus fractured. Still, the response was adjustment rather than cessation. A different dose, a new schedule. Cocaine remained central. New York's silence around side effects was not ignorance, it was preference. The city valued momentum over introspection. Cocaine enabled momentum. The cost was paid in increments too small to demand attention, until they were not. For a long time, the side effects remained unnamed, and in that silence, cocaine's hold deepened, its consequences deferred by a culture unwilling to listen to what the body was trying to say. Alertness became a visible virtue. In Gilded Age New York, the face itself was expected to testify to readiness. Eyes bright, posture composed, expression engaged. A slack gaze suggested indifference. A heavy lid implied failure. The city learned to read faces as evidence of worth, and cocaine proved remarkably adept at shaping that evidence. The alert face signaled participation. It reassured employers, hosts, patrons, and colleagues that attention was being paid, that effort was present, that the individual was prepared to respond. This expectation extended across professions and classes. One did not merely do one's work. One appeared ready to do it at all times. Cocaine supported this performance with precision. It sharpened the gaze and tightened focus. The eyes remained open and responsive, even as fatigue pressed inward. The drug did not distort expression. It refined it. The face appeared engaged without strain. This mattered deeply in a culture that equated visible alertness with competence. Over time, the alert face became a requirement rather than an ideal. Those who could not maintain it were quietly discounted. Tired eyes suggested unreliability. A distant expression implied disinterest. Cocaine allowed users to avoid these judgments. It preserved the appearance that the city rewarded. This emphasis on appearance intensified reliance. When alertness could be maintained chemically, its absence felt unacceptable. Ordinary human fluctuation, moments of dullness, quiet, withdrawal, was interpreted as deficiency. Cocaine raised the standard for what a functional face looked like. Social reinforcement accelerated this shift. Individuals who appeared perpetually attentive were praised. Their energy was admired. Cocaine's role in sustaining this appearance remained unspoken. The city saw only the result and demanded it of others. The body, however, experienced a different reality. Maintaining the alert face required increasing effort. Sleep shortened. The nervous system remained engaged. The mind stayed vigilant long after rest was required. Cocaine compensated for this imbalance quietly, but the cost accumulated beneath the surface. Medical reassurance persisted. As long as individuals remained functional and present, concern felt unnecessary. The alert face masked internal strain. Doctors observed engagement, not exhaustion. Cocaine's effects aligned perfectly with this shallow assessment. Eventually, cracks appeared. Alertness became brittle. Irritability surfaced. Focus wavered unpredictably. The face could no longer conceal what the body had absorbed. Yet even then, the response was management rather than retreat. More adjustment, more calibration. Cocaine remained central. The cult of alert faces did not arise from vanity alone. It reflected a deeper fear that disengagement signaled irrelevance. Cocaine protected users from this fear by keeping them visibly present. It allowed them to meet a standard that had quietly exceeded natural limits. New York rewarded what it could. C. Cocaine shaped what was seen. And in doing so, it ensured that alertness became not a state of readiness, but a mask worn until it could no longer be sustained. In Gilded Age, New York, dependence was rarely named as such. Success, endurance, and composure were admired. Fatigue, hesitation, and faltering were criticized. Cocaine thrived in this environment, disguising reliance as virtue. The city applauded those who maintained function under strain, never noticing that the very energy they celebrated was chemically sustained. Early use had seemed optional. A dose to meet a long day, a supplement for a particularly demanding evening. But repetition quieted choice. The body learned to rely on assistance, while the mind interpreted continuity as competence. The illusion was perfect. Reliance appeared indistinguishable from ability. The offices, parlors, and salons of New York reinforced this perception. Workers, socialites, performers all presented themselves as tireless. They answered calls, attended meetings, delivered performances, and maintained conversation with precision. Those who did so without visible strain were admired. Cocaine's presence was invisible, its effects absorbed into expectation. Even the users believed in this self-image. They did not feel weakened, they felt prepared. The drug allowed them to match the pace of the city without faltering. They measured their own performance against the standards set by their peers, not against the limits of their nervous systems. When the body protested, the drug masked the signals. Endurance was interpreted as discipline rather than necessity. Professional approval reinforced the illusion. Physicians endorsed measured doses. Pharmacists dispensed carefully. Journals described effects with calm authority. Each affirmation strengthened confidence. Reliance was recast as prudence. To follow instruction was responsibility. To falter without chemical support was failure. Social observation reinforced the pattern further. Families, colleagues, and acquaintances saw only sustained alertness, composure, and responsiveness. They could not observe what occurred beneath the surface: shortened sleep, restless nerves, irritability, and mounting strain. Cocaine preserved appearances, ensuring that dependence remained hidden under the guise of achievement. Over time, the line between enhancement and necessity blurred. A day without the drug felt heavier, more laborious, less controlled. What had once been assistance became prerequisite. Yet this shift went largely unnoticed. Competence and reliance were conflated. Success seemed inherent, not chemically supported. The consequences accumulated quietly. Nervous systems remained engaged without rest. Fatigue was postponed but not removed. Recovery was deferred. Memory, judgment, and temper were slowly eroded beneath calm surfaces. Cocaine's effect was not dramatic. It was gradual, insidious, perfectly aligned with the city's praise of uninterrupted function. New York's obsession with output ensured that this deception succeeded. Chemical support was invisible to those who valued results above process. Observers could not discern dependence behind achievement. The drug's power lay in this seamless integration into daily life. By the time awareness emerged, if it ever did, the habit was already entrenched. Attempts to reduce reliance revealed the cost: exhaustion, irritability, diminished focus. The drug's absence exposed what had been concealed. Endurance had been bought at a quiet, cumulative price. Dependence that looked like success persisted because appearance was all the city required. Cocaine allowed the body to comply, the mind to believe, and the world to applaud. And in this convergence, the very energy that seemed proof of mastery became proof of reliance, invisible to everyone but the one who required it. Sleep, once a sanctuary, had begun to vanish quietly from the lives of New York citizens. In Gilded Age apartments and narrow offices alike, the rhythm of rest was subordinated to expectation. The city demanded wakefulness. Nights were extended by gaslight, by obligation, by the hum of engines and conversation that never ceased. Fatigue, once honored as necessary, was treated as inconvenience. Cocaine intervened, allowing the body to endure without the pause that sleep required. At first, the loss went unnoticed. A single night without full rest felt tolerable. Morning brought sufficient energy, buoyed by the stimulant's subtle support. Individuals attributed wakefulness to dedication rather than chemical assistance. The illusion was convincing. As nights lengthened and demands increased, cocaine became the invisible partner in preserving continuity. In offices, clerks remained alert past hours that had once been considered late. Typists' fingers continued to fly across keys while eyelids threatened collapse. In salons and parlors, hosts and guests maintained poise despite the late hour. Performers lingered after performances, their composure sustained, their conversation sharp. The absence of sleep was masked by outward order. Cocaine allowed bodies to continue functioning, silently deferring nature's insistence on rest. Medical reassurance compounded the effect. Doctors framed the absence of sleep as acceptable, provided alertness and performance were maintained. If rest was postponed without immediate collapse, it was considered a manageable risk. Cocaine, administered in measured doses, maintained the appearance of normalcy. Concern was muted, if not absent entirely. Yet, beneath the surface, the body protested. The nervous system, kept artificially engaged, began to accumulate strain. Hormonal cycles and metabolic rhythms faltered. Subtle irritability emerged. Reflexes dulled. Concentration wavered, even as the outward appearance of focus persisted. Cocaine masked these signs, maintaining composure and producing the impression of endurance. The distinction between function and restoration blurred. The social and professional consequences reinforced this pattern. Wakefulness was admired. The restless were celebrated. Late nights became a badge of honor. To sleep, or to display fatigue, was to signal weakness. Cocaine allowed citizens to meet these expectations without apparent cost. The city rewarded those who did not rest, while simultaneously ensuring that the absence of sleep remained invisible. Over weeks and months, sleep receded further. Restless nights became ordinary, and the body's normal recovery was increasingly deferred. Dreams, when they occurred, were fragmented and fleeting. The restorative cycles that once governed mood, memory, and resilience were disrupted. Yet the immediate utility of wakefulness outweighed distant consequences in a city preoccupied with productivity and appearance. This pattern created a quiet, cumulative hazard. Individuals did not collapse spectacularly. They adapted incrementally. They could continue functioning, performing, appearing competent, even as the systems that sustained them were quietly eroded. Cocaine did not demand this vigilance. It permitted it, enforcing endurance without appeal. New York applauded the sleepless. Cocaine enabled that applause to continue. And in the absence of the body's natural rhythm, the city learned to expect what it had once treated as extraordinary. Citizens awake at all hours, alert and composed, oblivious to the slow attrition occurring beneath the surface. Sleep, once an unquestioned right, had become optional, and in its place, chemical vigilance reigned. Nerves, once a gentle messenger of need, had begun to insist. In Gilded Age New York, the pace of life demanded attention without pause, yet the body's instruments were not designed for unbroken vigilance. Cocaine intervened, quieting the signals temporarily, sharpening faculties, and allowing motion to continue. But it could not erase the tension entirely. The nervous system adapted, becoming restless beneath the surface, perpetually alert, yet never at ease. The change was subtle at first, a flicker of impatience, a pulse that refused to slow, muscles that twitched in the quiet of evening. These signals were faint, easy to misattribute to the city itself, the demands, the excitement, the friction of urban life. Cocaine obscured their source. It did not stop the body's complaints. It suppressed their expression, creating the illusion that all was well. In offices, nerves manifested as restless fingers, small hesitations between letters typed, a tightening of shoulders beneath crisp shirts. Clerks and typists continued their work with apparent precision, yet under that outward order, the body strained to maintain composure. The stimulant held alertness, but it could not fully restore serenity. The city, accustomed to seeing results rather than effort, remained oblivious. Socially, the effect was equally insidious. Hosts, performers, and visitors carried an energy that seemed tireless, yet internally, the body's rhythm was unsettled. The restless pulse beneath steady conversation made sustained politeness a small triumph. Every smile, every nod, every laugh required not only attention but management, a suppression of tremors that would have been natural under fatigue. Medical guidance reinforced the tolerance of unrest. Doctors framed heightened nerves as evidence of engagement, responsiveness, or refinement. Symptoms of overactivation were interpreted as signs of productivity rather than imbalance. Cocaine's role in sustaining this state went unremarked. The body's complaints were reinterpreted as virtue, yet the consequences accumulated. Nervous energy, constantly engaged, fatigued other systems. Sleep became fragmented, even when attempted. Circulation and digestion were subtly affected. Mental focus, while superficially maintained, required more effort to sustain. The body endured chemically, but it paid incrementally in quiet, unseen increments. Each day's effort was repaid in subtle strain the next. For the individual, perception was misleading. The mind felt sharp, capable, unyielding. The eyes remained bright, the hands precise. The outward performance was flawless. It suggested mastery. Yet beneath that mastery, the nervous system was unrelenting, recording tension, marking exhaustion, and adapting to sustain a pace it was not meant to maintain naturally. New York rewarded this state. Citizens who displayed composure, efficiency, and attention were praised. Cocaine ensured that these external markers were preserved, even as the internal environment became increasingly taxed. The city, unable to see beyond appearances, reinforced the pattern: more endurance, more expectation, more quiet adaptation. Eventually, the persistence of restless nerves transformed expectation into standard. What had once been exceptional alertness in the absence of sleep became ordinary. The body's protests were quieted, overlooked, rationalized. Cocaine had allowed nerves to remain active without outward consequence, embedding chemical reliance into the rhythm of life. In this city, nerves did not merely react, they were co-opted into performance. Cocaine's intervention ensured compliance, yet at the cost of subtle, invisible strain. The individual appeared triumphant, the city applauded, and beneath the surface, the body had learned to resist rest while maintaining the illusion of ease. Control had become an act, rehearsed and displayed, as essential as attire or manners in Gilded Age New York. It was not enough to be in command, one had to appear so at all times. Fatigue, distraction, or lapse were unthinkable. The city demanded a performance of mastery, and cocaine became the unseen stagehand, ensuring that the body, mind, and nerves obeyed with quiet compliance. Each day was constructed as a sequence of measured actions. Offices opened precisely at 9, salons were expected to host without pause, and performances concluded only to flow seamlessly into receptions or rehearsals. To falter was to risk reputation. Cocaine allowed the individual to move through these obligations with apparent ease. Alertness remained unbroken. Hands did not tremble. Speech did not falter. The body, in public, was impeccable. The performance was not confined to high society. Clerks and typists, artists and performers, socialites and professionals, all were implicated. The city's rhythm required them to appear tireless, competent, and engaged. Cocaine preserved that appearance, masking the internal erosion of energy and the subtle tremors of strain. Discipline was rehearsed privately. Each morning began with preparation, measurement, timing, consideration of dosage. The substance was administered with precision, ensuring that the day could be met without visible faltering. The routine itself became a form of control, a ritual that reinforced the illusion of mastery. To plan, to measure, to administer, these acts performed control before it was even needed. Public observation reinforced this expectation. Colleagues in society judged the outcome, not the effort. Composure was applauded. Strain was invisible. Cocaine ensured that the outward metrics of control, posture, conversation, engagement, remained unbroken, allowing the user to maintain the social fiction that effortless mastery was inherent. Yet the body's needs were deferred rather than erased, sleep shortened, Restlessness persisted, appetite shifted. Each day's performance required more chemical intervention to maintain the same facade. Cocaine enabled this incremental increase without immediate consequence, allowing the individual to continue performing control while quietly edging toward dependence. Medical oversight lent further legitimacy. Doctors praised the measured application of the drug, emphasizing moderation and routine. Professional validation implied that control was not only acceptable, but virtuous. The substance's presence was rationalized as a tool for maintaining composure, further blurring the line between autonomy and reliance. As weeks and months passed, this daily performance became expected. What had once been a support evolved into a necessity. To function at the level demanded by society required adherence to the chemical ritual. The individual believed they were exercising discipline. In truth, they were preserving the appearance of it. The city itself reinforced the pattern. Rapid schedules, constant obligations, and relentless observation left no room for deviation. Cocaine allowed compliance without visible collapse. The performance of control became the measure of worth, the arbiter of social and professional success. By the time the internal strain became apparent, insomnia, irritability, nervous tension, the act of control was already entrenched. Cocaine had transformed endurance into performance. The body obeyed chemically. The mind interpreted this obedience as mastery, and the city, blind to the subtle cost, continued to applaud the illusion. Control was no longer natural. It was performed. And in performing it daily, New Yorkers learned to accept the absence of rest, the quiet erosion of the nervous system, and the hidden assistance that made their endurance possible. Even the most disciplined bodies have limits. In Gilded Age New York, the human frame was expected to bend without complaint, to comply with schedules, obligations, and appearances, yet maintain the composure of perfection. Cocaine offered compliance, yet the body's resistance was persistent, subtle, and increasingly difficult to ignore. It refused to yield entirely. At first, the defiance was quiet. Minor tremors in the hands, a flicker of fatigue in the eyelids, the creeping sense of heaviness in the legs. These were dismissed as inconsequential, explained away by the city's demands or the pressures of modern life. Cocaine masked them, allowing individuals to maintain appearances while the body whispered its protest beneath the surface. In offices and salons alike, the tension was barely perceptible. Clerks continued to type, performers remained upright, hosts engaged guests with charm. Every outward sign suggested mastery, yet internally, muscles cramped, nerves twitched, and the mind signaled the need for pause. Cocaine permitted the illusion of obedience, but it could not rewrite biology entirely. The city, blinded by appearances, reinforced this denial. Success was measured by output, attentiveness, and composure. The body's murmurs were irrelevant as long as the performance persisted. Employees who faltered publicly risked censure. Those who maintained function were praised. Cocaine allowed bodies to comply with expectation, even as compliance became increasingly unnatural. Medical instruction framed these minor protests as manageable. Adjustments in dosage or timing were suggested to maintain outward stability. Rarely was cessation recommended. Professional confidence created a buffer between internal signals and social consequence. The body was kept in service, its resistance translated into data, measured and managed chemically rather than heated biologically. Even in private, the struggle continued. Individuals learned to ignore the subtle protests, the restless pulses, shallow breathing, aching joints. The nervous system remained engaged beyond its natural threshold. Sleep shortened, appetite shifted, sensation dulled. Each day's endurance required increasing chemical intervention to preserve appearances, and the body's compliance became progressively less voluntary. Yet the resistance was persistent. Cocaine's efficacy was remarkable, but not infinite. Small failures began to appear, tremors too pronounced to conceal, moments of dizziness, irritability that seeped into conversation. These were often rationalized as stress, overwork, or insufficient preparation. The illusion of obedience remained intact, even as the body signaled its limits. Society remained unaware. The city applauded results without recognizing the strain that produced them. Public perception valued execution over process. The chemical reinforcement of function was invisible. Only the individual experienced the quiet friction, the negotiation between chemical obedience and physical reality. This refusal of total compliance was instructive. It revealed the discrepancy between expectation and human capacity. Cocaine allowed the body to continue functioning, but it did not eliminate the underlying demand for rest, restoration, and balance. The substance delayed surrender, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. By the time consequences became unavoidable, insomnia, chronic tension, irritability, the body had already communicated its dissatisfaction in subtle, persistent ways. Cocaine had enforced obedience outwardly, but internally, the body's resistance persisted, a quiet reminder that no chemical could fully override the natural limits of human endurance. In New York, bodies were praised for compliance, yet even in the most disciplined, a silent rebellion simmered beneath. Cocaine could maintain appearances, it could support ambition, it could postpone collapse, but the body, stubbornly, refused total obedience. Even the most confident authority is not infallible. In the quiet offices and polished consulting rooms of Gilded Age, New York, physicians who had once spoken of cocaine with calm certainty began, imperceptibly at first, to hesitate. Their hesitation was subtle, a shift in tone, a pause in recommendation, a small measure of doubt concealed beneath professional composure. The city did not notice, but the change was significant. For years, medical endorsement had legitimized cocaine. Physicians had described its effects in measured language, precise, controlled, predictable. Patients trusted the recommendation. Pharmacists dispensed with confidence. The substance's orderliness reinforced belief in its safety. Compliance appeared scientific, rational, and civilized, and for a time this trust seemed justified. Yet, as months and years of use accumulated, quiet observations began to trouble the mind. Patients returned with complaints of insomnia, nervous tension, restlessness. Minor tremors, irregular pulse, and subtle irritability emerged. None were dramatic enough to disrupt public performance, but all suggested a pattern. Cocaine, it seemed, did not simply assist, it altered the body's baseline, raising expectations for endurance and masking the body's natural rhythms. The hesitation was not immediately articulated. Physicians were careful. They continued to prescribe, to recommend, to measure doses. Yet their language softened. Where they had once spoken with certainty, they now spoke conditionally. Use with caution, they suggested. Observe effects carefully. These phrases were faint, almost perfunctory, but they reflected a new awareness. The substance that had seemed entirely obedient might not be entirely so. Professional networks amplified the effect. Physicians shared anecdotes in private, murmuring of subtle complications, of patients who required increasing doses, of nervous systems that refused to settle. The reports were framed clinically, not alarmingly. Yet together they suggested the beginnings of concern. Cocaine's reliability, once assumed, was now being scrutinized. The city remained unaware. Patients continued to rely on the substance, reassured by the absence of overt alarm and the continued appearance of composure. Social and professional obligations demanded productivity, and cocaine allowed it. Public observation remained unchanged. The subtle shifts in medical confidence were invisible outside. The consulting room. For physicians, hesitation created a quiet tension. They wished to honor their authority, to maintain trust, and yet they could not ignore the patterns emerging beneath the surface. Recommendations became conditional. Advice was tempered. The phrase, "as needed," appeared more frequently. Doses were measured more cautiously. Observations were recorded more diligently. The city received none of this nuance, only continued performance. This moment marked the beginning of the slow erosion of certainty. Cocaine had been embraced because it was orderly, predictable, and compatible with social ideals. Now, subtle inconsistencies in its effects suggested complexity beyond immediate observation. The very professionals whose authority had legitimized its use began to recognize the quiet unpredictability of its influence. Still, Hesitation was measured, discreet, almost imperceptible. The substance was too integrated, the city too reliant for alarm to be sounded. Publicly. Physicians noted, adjusted, and advised, but they did not interrupt. Cocaine continued to circulate, lives continued to function, applause persisted for composure that had been chemically maintained. The first cracks in unwavering endorsement were present, if nearly invisible. The city would not perceive them, patients would not admit them. Yet within the calm offices where authority had once been absolute, doubt had begun to creep in, a quiet recognition that even controlled substances carry consequences, and that even the most disciplined chemical ally cannot erase the limits of the human body. Newsprint had long been the pulse of New York, carrying reports of progress, scandal, and society with equal measure. In the early days of cocaine's introduction, the press mirrored the confidence of the city's authorities. Articles described its effects with precision and optimism, often quoting physicians, emphasizing its clarity, and celebrating its alignment with productivity. The language was calm, factual, and persuasive. Cocaine was presented as modern, rational, and unproblematic. Yet the inked pages, like the city itself, could not remain entirely obedient. Reports began to accumulate, subtle, scattered, easy to dismiss. Editors received letters noting restlessness, sleepless nights, or irritability among the ambitious and the tireless. Minor incidents once overlooked were now recorded with cautious attention. The press began to adopt a new tone, still measured, still polite, but tinged with reservation. This shift was delicate. Newspapers were conscious of their audience, professionals, patrons, and families who valued decorum and authority. Alarmist language would have undermined credibility. Thus, the new tone was cautious, almost invisible, suggesting oversight rather than catastrophe. Words like observe carefully, noted in certain cases, and requires discretion appeared quietly in columns, more as footnotes than headlines. Cocaine was no longer entirely unchallenged, yet it remained respectable. The change reflected the emerging awareness among physicians and pharmacists. Editors had begun to sense a discrepancy between the public presentation of composure and the private reports of unease. Where once reliance on cocaine could be assumed harmless, now it appeared to carry consequences subtle enough to merit mention. The press did not yet name addiction or dependence. It implied the possibility of risk, allowing readers to infer without confrontation. Socially, this nuance influenced perception. People continued to use cocaine, reassured by the absence of dramatic warnings, yet aware that the substance was no longer treated as entirely benign. The polite caution of the press mirrored the careful observation of the city's professionals. It reinforced the idea that vigilance was prudent, even among the well-disciplined. The narrative shifted from certainty to conditional approval. The new tone was particularly evident in medical journals and society pages. Where early reports had praised focus and endurance, later mentions described minor irritability, restless energy, or difficulty sleeping. These observations were couched in scientific and socially acceptable language, ensuring they did not provoke alarm but suggested attention. Cocaine was no longer purely enhancement. It had become a substance whose use required thought and care. Even minor critiques were absorbed into the broader culture of performance. Cocaine remained essential for those expected to maintain composure, productivity, and social presence. The press did not prohibit use, it only invited careful observation. In this way, the substance maintained its place, though with a subtle undercurrent of caution now accompanying it. By introducing measured concern, the press subtly reshaped public perception. Users began to recognize that chemical support came with responsibility, even if the high cost was not immediately visible. The language remained respectful, precise, and restrained, reflecting the city's broader values, yet it acknowledged that endurance, like the body, had limits. The city continued to celebrate performance, and cocaine continued to facilitate it. Yet now, beneath the surface of admiration and applause, a quiet awareness lingered. Even substances presented as orderly, modern, and rational might carry consequences that the eye could not immediately perceive. The press had found its new tone, not alarm, not condemnation, but cautious observation, a reflection of the subtle unease that had begun to ripple through the society it chronicled. Cocaine had arrived as remedy, a solution administered with precision and calm. It promised clarity, focus, composure, and relief from the weariness that threatened New York's relentless tempo. At first, its use was circumscribed, deliberate, justified by need rather than desire. But the line between cure and habit is narrow, and the city's rhythm made the crossing almost inevitable. In offices, parlors, and salons alike, the drug's utility became a standard. Long hours required it, social obligations demanded it, the performance of composure depended upon it. Each successful instance of administration reinforced the idea that the body functioned best with its aid. The occasional dose, once exceptional, became routine. Habit did not announce itself. It emerged incrementally in the silent repetition of dependence. A clerk relied on it to complete a long day of ledger work. A performer took it to maintain energy through evening engagements. A socialite found her attention sharpened during marathon gatherings. Each administration was justified by necessity. Each repeated use felt prudent. What began as remedy became preparation, then routine, then expectation. The transition was reinforced by perception. Cocaine preserved outward performance, sleep shortened, nerves tightened, attention sharpened, yet no obvious collapse occurred. Observers applauded the results, unaware of the incremental cost. Dependence remained invisible, masked by composure. The user interpreted continuity as self-discipline rather than reliance. Medical authority contributed to the illusion. Physicians emphasized measured doses, careful timing, and rational application. They framed repeated use as management, not indulgence. Professional endorsement reinforced the idea that the drug was safe, appropriate, and compatible with ambition. The line between assistance and necessity blurred with each consultation. Social structures amplified the pattern. The city rewarded those who maintained composure, attended every meeting, met every expectation. Cocaine ensured that appearances could be sustained. The drug became a tool of conformity. To participate fully in society, one learned to rely upon it without acknowledging the shift from remedy to routine. The psychological transformation was subtle but pervasive. The mind came to anticipate the drug's effects. Ordinary activity felt more demanding without it. Mental clarity, once enhanced, became baseline only when chemically supported. Habit did not feel urgent, it felt normal. Its absence was discomforting, its presence reassuring. Dependence disguised itself as preparation. Over time, the habit entrenched itself in private life as well. Bottles discreetly kept in cabinets, doses timed to coincide with demanding days or evenings. The ritual of administration became another form of discipline. The repetition normalized the presence of the substance. What had begun as temporary assistance became permanent scaffolding for daily function. The consequences were delayed, subtle, and largely unobserved. Nervous systems remained tense, sleep cycles fractured, appetite and mood fluctuated. The body, compliant outwardly, was quietly adapting to chemical intervention. Cocaine had not created strain. It had made endurance possible in its presence, and dependence invisible in its absence. New York continued to celebrate performance. Cocaine continued to facilitate it. The city's admiration, the drug's efficacy, and the human desire for reliability converged to obscure the transformation. What had once been cure had become habit, indistinguishable from competence, unremarkable and quietly indispensable. Even in a city that prized discretion and composure, authority eventually observed what had gone unspoken for too long. Gilded Age New York, for all its admiration of self-discipline and chemical enhancement, could not entirely ignore the signs that cocaine's influence was extending beyond the bounds of measured assistance. Subtle complaints, minor incidents, and accumulating reports of restlessness, sleeplessness, and nervous strain compelled regulators to act, though cautiously, quietly, and with polite deliberation. The first interventions were hardly dramatic. Boards of medical oversight issued recommendations for careful dosing, warnings that cocaine was not to be administered without professional supervision, and advisories on the possible effects of repeated use. The tone was calm, reasoned, and almost apologetic. The substance had long been treated as a modern convenience, and the arrival of regulation acknowledged its potential for harm without condemning its presence outright. Pharmacists, ever vigilant for adherence to law and propriety, began to adjust their practices. Bottles were labeled with greater specificity, quantities were restricted, documented, and tracked. Instructions for administration emphasized caution, observation, and limitation. Cocaine, which had once flowed unobstructed into offices and parlors alike, now encountered the subtle constraints of legal oversight. Social perception began to shift, though not dramatically. Public discourse treated regulation as refinement rather than prohibition. Readers in error, newspapers and journals were informed that supervision was necessary, that prudence was required, and that responsible management of the substance reflected civilized conduct. No panic was suggested, no dramatic rhetoric was employed. The emphasis was on moderation, control, and observation. For the city's users, these adjustments were absorbed without resistance. They had long practiced discretion, careful measurement, and adherence to professional advice. The imposition of regulation did not appear threatening. On the contrary, it reinforced the narrative that cocaine was a substance to be respected and managed, rather than indulged recklessly. The familiar rituals, measured doses, quiet administration, attention to timing, remained intact, now supplemented by the subtle imprimatur of official oversight. Yet, regulation carried implications the city could not immediately perceive. By formalizing control, authorities acknowledged that the substance was capable of harm. Habits, once invisible and justified by performance, now existed within a framework of surveillance. The chemical scaffolding that had supported endurance was now subtly marked with accountability. Dependents could no longer proceed entirely unobserved. Within homes, offices, and studios, cocaine continued to support vigilance, productivity, and composure. But users began to note that absence of the drug might attract scrutiny, that deviation from prescribed limits would be observed. Reliance became more structured, more intentional. The invisible scaffolding of habit acquired a visible framework, subtly altering behavior without altering results. Medical and regulatory caution also served as a psychological reminder. Awareness of oversight reinforced users' own discipline, even as it disguised the growing need for chemical assistance. The daily performance, upright posture, clear mind, steady nerves, remained uninterrupted, but now it was maintained under the quiet gaze of authority as well as society. New York applauded continued productivity. Cocaine continued to deliver it. Yet regulation had entered the room, reshaping the landscape subtly. It did not remove the drug, nor did it demand abstinence, but it acknowledged a boundary, that even substances of refinement could exceed the limits of safety. In doing so, it quietly transformed the culture of reliance into one of monitored endurance, where discipline and chemical support now coexisted under the watchful eyes of law and propriety. Even substances admired for their modernity can outstay their welcome. By the late years of Gilded Age New York, cocaine had traversed every threshold, from the apothecary to the office, the parlor, the stage, and the bedroom. It had been praised, managed, and regulated, yet the quiet accumulation of consequences, restless nerves, fragmented sleep, subtle dependence, could no longer be ignored. The city, ever concerned with appearances, finally took steps to withdraw it from circulation, though always with restraint and civility. The removal was deliberate and methodical. It did not arrive with scandal or spectacle. Boards of physicians and municipal authorities framed the action in terms of refinement, public safety, and moral responsibility. The language emphasized propriety, moderation, and reasoned caution. Cocaine was no longer treated as a modern convenience. It had become a substance whose presence required supervision, limitation, and ultimately, withdrawal. Pharmacies began to reduce supplies, limit prescriptions, and require documentation for each transaction. Labels carried stronger advisories. Instructions emphasized caution and attention to long-term effect. Where once the drug had been easily accessible, it now demanded formality. Its removal was gradual, measured, almost invisible, mirroring the discretion with which it had been administered for decades. Socially, the transition was similarly understated. The city's elite did not suddenly abandon their habits. Rather, they adjusted quietly, often substituting other stimulants or moderating doses under professional guidance. The parlor and salon no longer displayed the substance as openly. Dependence was acknowledged privately, managed discreetly. The public, largely unaware, continued to admire the composure and energy of those whose routines had been supported chemically. Medical professionals framed the removal as an act of stewardship rather than prohibition. They emphasized prudence, the preservation of health, and the maintenance of order. Patients were instructed in tapering usage, observing effects, and adjusting routines accordingly. The emphasis was on continuity, maintaining performance while gradually disentangling the chemical scaffolding upon which daily life had relied. Yet the consequences of withdrawal were subtle but persistent. Nervous systems, accustomed to constant stimulation, protested quietly. Sleep cycles struggled to reassert themselves. Fatigue returned gradually, often interpreted as a lapse in discipline rather than the delayed response of the body. Even as the substance receded, the habits it had enabled lingered, and dependence had left a mark that chemical absence could not erase entirely. The city continued its relentless rhythm. Offices demanded attention, salons required engagement, social appearances persisted. Cocaine's removal did not slow the pace, it merely required the body to respond without assistance it had come to expect. For many, this was a small shock, revealing the degree to which reliance had been normalized. The substance had quietly supported not only work and social life, but the illusion of effortless mastery. And yet, in its quiet withdrawal, the city remained convinced of propriety. No scandal marred the process, no dramatic admonitions were published. Cocaine was removed with the same subtlety that had marked its introduction, its rise, and its habitual presence. The city had learned through cautious observation and administrative intervention that even modern miracles must be contained. By the end of this process, cocaine was no longer the ubiquitous chemical companion it had once been. Its presence receded from counters, parlors, and offices alike. And in its absence, New Yorkers faced themselves in their endurance, realizing for the first time how much had depended on a substance that never demanded to be noticed, yet had quietly shaped the rhythms of a city unwilling to pause. The city did not pause when cocaine departed. It could not. New York had learned to operate at a pace that demanded vigilance, alertness, and ceaseless motion. Its citizens had been conditioned over decades to perform tirelessly, to appear composed, and to meet expectations that exceeded the limits of ordinary endurance. When the chemical scaffolding of cocaine was quietly removed, the city remained awake, but those who had relied upon it discovered the subtle cost of dependence. Sleep returned reluctantly, often in fragments. The nights that had once been managed through chemical intervention now stretched long and uneasy. Restlessness persisted. Nervous tension surfaced where it had been temporarily subdued. The body, long accustomed to artificial support, struggled to reconcile expectation with capacity. Fatigue, which had once been postponed indefinitely, could no longer be deferred entirely. The contrast between outward appearance and internal experience became acute. Citizens continued to maintain composure, for appearances remained paramount. Clerks, typists, performers, and socialites all presented the same polished, alert facade that had been reinforced by decades of chemical assistance. Yet beneath this veneer, the body whispered its protest. Muscles ached, eyes strained. The nervous system, habituated to constant stimulation, now quivered under its own unassisted rhythms. Professional observers noted the E-right shift with careful language. Physicians acknowledged the gradual readjustment of sleep cycles, the return of irritability, the subtle fraying of focus. They framed these developments in measured terms, emphasizing patience and moderation. The city, accustomed to performance, interpreted these effects as minor inconveniences rather than systemic consequences. Cocaine's absence was silent, its removal as discreet as its introduction. Social expectation continued unabated. Salons, offices, and stages demanded engagement without interruption. Citizens were observed, judged, and rewarded based on output and appearance, not internal experience. The applause remained for those who performed successfully, oblivious to the quiet struggle beneath the surface. The city itself, in its relentless momentum, left no space for pause, reflection, or acknowledgement of human limitation. Yet, even in this relentless rhythm, lessons quietly emerged. Individuals began to sense the body's limits where, once they had been masked. Nights of poor sleep highlighted the dependency that had gone unnoticed. Small tremors and subtle fatigue became reminders that endurance had been chemically augmented for years. Cocaine's withdrawal revealed the scale of reliance, teaching the city in whispers what it had ignored in applause. The culture of vigilance had endured, even without the stimulant. Citizens adapted, slowly recalibrating their expectations and performance. The city continued to operate, unchanged in schedule, volume, and demand. Cocaine's absence did not halt progress, but it did expose the quiet cost of prior reliance. Diminished resilience, fractured rest, and the awareness that what had seemed effortless had for decades been chemically assisted. New York remained awake. Its offices, parlors, and theaters continued their ceaseless activity. But those who had depended on cocaine discovered the subtle fractures beneath their composure. The city had survived the substance's departure, but its citizens were forever marked by the rhythm it had enforced. Performance remained, but the human limits it had once masked now whispered insistently. Cocaine was gone. The city continued, and in the silence left by its removal, the people of New York finally understood, perhaps too late, that the pursuit of unbroken wakefulness, the insistence on perpetual alertness, and the relentless measurement of performance had left them alert indeed, but weary in ways that no applause could conceal.